Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The water level alarm went off at 1:38 in the morning. I was in the control room at Red Bank Reservoir, about 6 miles outside Lancaster. I worked nights there 3 times a week, mostly checking pumps, watching security cameras, and logging anything unusual around the dam and treatment intake. My name was Paul Dempsey. I was 52 at the time and had worked around water systems most of my adult life. I knew how the reservoir behaved in heavy rain, drought, high wind, and freezing weather. That night, none of those conditions applied. It was cold and completely clear. The forecast had said -2 by dawn. There was no wind, and the water looked flat under the floodlights. The reservoir was roughly oval, a little over a mile long, with wooded slopes on 2 sides and open farmland beyond the dam. The first alarm showed a rise of 4 centimeters across all 6 level sensors. That was impossible. The sensors were spread around the reservoir. Some were mounted near the dam, others by the intake tower and the northern shore. Water could rise unevenly during a surge, but all 6 units reported the same increase at the same second. I thought it was a software error. I opened the raw readings. Each sensor had jumped from its normal level to 4 centimeters higher, held for 8 seconds, then dropped back. No pump had started. No gate had moved. There had been no rainfall for 2 days. I reset the alarm and wrote the time in the log. Then it happened again. This time the reported rise was 7 centimeters. I looked through the control room window. The reservoir remained still. The floodlights along the dam reflected as narrow white lines. There was no wave, no surge, and no water spilling onto the lower steps of the intake platform. But the buoys moved. There were 12 yellow marker buoys around the restricted zone near the tower. All 12 dipped at the same moment. They did not lean or drift. They went straight down as if something had pressed on them from above. Only the top sections remained visible for maybe 3 seconds. Then they rose together. Water ran from their sides, but no ripples spread outward. I stood up so quickly that my chair hit the filing cabinet. The reservoir looked wrong after that. Nothing obvious had changed, but the reflection seemed too steady. The stars above the water were sharp, and the surface beneath them looked almost black. I picked up the radio and called Martin Price, the duty engineer. He lived in a cottage near the access road and could reach the site in 10 minutes. "Martin, I've got a level fault on all sensors," he answered, sounding half asleep. "What kind of fault?" "Simultaneous rise, 7 centimeters. "Actual water movement?" "I don't know. The buoys went under." There was a pause. "All of them?" "Yes." He said he would get dressed and come over. I checked the cameras. Camera 3 covered the intake tower and most of the buoy line. The recorded image showed the buoys dipping exactly as I had seen. The water around them stayed smooth. Camera 1, mounted above the control room entrance, showed the wider reservoir. At the moment the sensors rose, the picture darkened slightly, as if a cloud had passed over the stars. There were no clouds. I replayed the footage. The darkening was not across the whole sky. It covered a broad oval patch directly above the center of the reservoir. Inside that patch, the stars disappeared. The surrounding stars remained visible and fixed. I stepped outside. The cold felt sharp in my nose and throat. Frost covered the railings and the grass beside the path. The pumps hummed beneath the concrete, low and steady. I looked up. The sky was clear. Or it seemed clear at first. Then I found the empty patch. It sat above the reservoir, slightly north of the intake tower. A large group of stars was missing. The edge was difficult to see because there was no cloud, no light, and no outline. It was simply an area where the sky looked blank. I moved along the dam. The patch stayed over the water. It was too large to block with my hand. From where I stood, it looked wider than the treatment building and longer than the buoy line. I knew the stars in that part of the sky well enough to recognize that something was wrong. Orion was low to the west. The plow was behind me. The blank area covered several weaker stars I had seen earlier during my round. I held up my phone and took a picture. The image showed ordinary stars. No gap. I took another. Same result. A soft clicking sound came from the reservoir. 3 clicks. A pause. 2. It was not loud. It sounded like someone tapping metal underwater. I went back inside and checked the hydrophone feed from the intake. We used it to detect unusual vibration around the pipes. The display showed 5 short spikes, 3 close together, a gap, 2 more. The next alarm came at 1:46. All 6 sensors rose by 11 centimeters. The buoys dropped again. This time they disappeared completely beneath the surface. The chains holding them should have stopped that. Each buoy was attached to a weighted line with enough slack for normal changes, but not enough to pull the entire float underwater. The reservoir surface still did not move. No splash, no wave. The buoys reappeared after 5 seconds. A low pressure filled my ears. The control room windows gave a faint rattle. I checked the barometer. The needle had fallen sharply, though the external weather station showed normal air pressure. The radio on my desk clicked. Martin's voice came through. "Paul, are you outside?" I picked it up. "No, I'm in the control room." Static followed. Then his voice repeated the question with exactly the same timing. "Paul, are you outside?" I called him on my phone. He answered from his cottage. He had not used the radio. I told him not to come down alone. He said he was already in his truck and would wait at the upper gate until I met him. I put on my coat and took the handheld torch. Before leaving, I checked the live sensor map once more. The water level was normal. Then the entire screen changed. Every sensor showed the same number, not a water height. It showed 0.0. The intake depth, dam level, and shore sensors all read 0, as if the reservoir had emptied. The pumps continued operating normally. I looked through the window. The water remained there. The display stayed at 0 for 6 seconds, then returned. The control room lights dimmed. Outside, the floodlights along the dam one by one from east to west. The darkness moved toward the reservoir center. The empty patch in the sky became easier to see. It was lower now. I could not explain how I knew that. There was no visible surface to compare, but the blank area seemed larger and closer. Stars at the edge stretched slightly before disappearing behind it. The clicking sound returned. This time it came from above the roof. 3 clicks. A pause. 2. I opened the door and stepped onto the path. Every buoy dipped halfway under. They stayed there. The water around them looked thick, almost like oil, but only in the floodlight from the intake tower. Farther out, the surface appeared normal. A fox stood near the fence on the opposite bank. It faced the reservoir with its body low and its ears flat. Several birds lifted from the trees behind it. They flew toward the water, reached the edge of the empty sky patch, and dropped sharply. Their wings beat hard as they turned away. The pressure in my ears increased. A vibration moved through the concrete beneath my boots. It was slow and deep, not like pump machinery. I felt it rise through my legs. The water sensors jumped again. 14 centimeters. The entire buoy line vanished. At the same moment, frost lifted from the railings in a fine white dust. It moved upward, not sideways in wind, straight up toward the blank area. I backed into the doorway. A broad section of the reservoir darkened. The darkness was not a shadow from cloud. It had a clean curved edge and moved slowly across the surface toward the dam. Stars reflected normally outside it. Inside it, the water reflected nothing. The dark section reached the intake tower. The metal railings groaned. Water climbed several centimeters up the concrete supports without forming waves. It looked as though the whole surface had risen beneath an invisible weight. Then something pressed downward. The top platform of the tower gave a low metallic knock. The water sank around the base in a smooth oval depression. I had seen wind pressure flatten water before, but this was different. The depression had no ripples and no spray. Its sides curved gently like a large thumb pressing into soft material. The buoys remained underwater along its edge. My radio turned on by itself. A voice said my name, Paul. It sounded like Martin. I did not answer. The voice repeated it. Then it said, "Open the gate." Martin was still waiting at the upper entrance. The radio crackled again. "Open the gate." This time, the voice came from outside, somewhere over the reservoir. I shut the control room door and locked it. The vibration strengthened. Several alarms activated at once. Intake pressure, structural movement, pump fault, perimeter sensor. Then all of them cleared. The blank patch above the water began to move. Stars disappeared along its northern edge and returned along the southern edge. The shape traveled toward the dam at a slow, steady pace. It was directly above the dark patch on the water. I understood then that the water had not risen naturally. Something overhead was pressing the entire surface down, and the sensors were reading the displacement as a rise against the walls. The shape moved closer. The windows rattled harder. A mug slid across the desk and fell onto the floor without breaking. The room filled with a metallic smell like wet coins and hot wires. The ceiling light flickered. For 1 second, a pale outline appeared in the glass reflection. It was long and curved, wider than the control room. Several dim marks ran along one side. One of them darkened. A narrow shape moved behind it. I turned toward the window. Nothing was physically visible outside, only the missing stars. The pressure became painful. I crouched behind the desk. The vibration passed through the building in a slow wave from the reservoir side to the rear wall. Every loose object shook. The radio transmitted my own breathing back to me with a delay. Then my voice said, "It's above the tower." I had not spoken. The last floodlight went out. The only light came from the control screens and the stars around the blank patch. The dark shape in the sky reached the dam. For a few seconds, the entire reservoir surface rose against the concrete wall. Water covered the lowest step and climbed the drainage grates. The sensors reported 18 centimeters, then 22. The dam itself did not move. The surface simply lifted everywhere at once. The windows bowed inward. I covered my head. A deep tone passed through the control room. It was too low to hear properly. My teeth hurt and my chest vibrated with it. The tone moved upward. The pressure released. Water struck the dam in one flat slap. The buoys came back to the surface together. Floodlights switched on from west to east. I looked through the window. The blank patch of sky was rising. Stars returned slowly beneath it, one group at a time. Along the upper edge, others vanished briefly before reappearing. The broad darkness moved away from the reservoir and climbed toward the east. A narrow strip of thin cloud had formed near the horizon. When the empty patch reached it, the cloud bent around a smooth oval space. For maybe 4 seconds, the shape became visible only by what cloud did. It stood almost upright. One end was narrower, the other curved outward. It was larger than the reservoir's intake zone. The pale marks appeared again inside the outline. One moved separately. Then the cloud closed behind it. The stars returned. The water sensors dropped to normal. My watch showed 1:53. The control room clock showed 2:11. I had lost 18 minutes, though I remembered the event continuously. Martin called my phone. He said he had been waiting at the upper gate for nearly half an hour. The access keypad had stopped accepting his code, and his truck clock had frozen at 1:47. I unlocked the gate remotely. He arrived 2 minutes later. We inspected the dam, intake tower, and sensor stations together. There was no visible damage. The waterline along the wall was wet 22 centimeters above the normal level. That matched the highest reading, but the reservoir had not gained any water. The overflow channel remained dry, and the downstream gauge showed no release. The buoy chains were twisted tightly around their anchors. Several metal links had stretched, though none had broken. Near the center of the dam, frost had vanished from a long oval patch of concrete. The patch was warm. The rest of the wall was below freezing. We checked the camera recordings. The wide camera showed ordinary water until 1:46. Then the image skipped to 2:05. During those 19 minutes, the file contained only black frames with working timestamps. The intake camera recorded the buoys dipping and disappearing, but the sky above them looked normal. The water level logs remained intact. All 6 sensors had risen together 4 times. The final reading showed 22 centimeters for nearly 3 minutes. The official explanation was a software synchronization fault combined with pressure changes from the pumps. The pump manufacturer said their equipment could not affect the entire reservoir surface. The Weather Service reported no pressure event and no aircraft activity overhead. I finished my shift at 7. Martin stayed until the day team arrived. I drove home after sunrise and slept until early afternoon. That evening, I found a new file on my phone. It was a 12-second video recorded at 1:58. I had no memory of filming it. The video showed the reservoir from outside the control room. The camera pointed upward. Most of the sky was black and full of stars. A broad oval section contained none. As the video continued, the empty patch moved slowly east. Near the end, several stars appeared inside it. They were not part of the sky behind. They formed a straight row and moved together. The final frame showed the reservoir surface below. Every buoy was underwater. In the center of the dark water, a pale oval reflection looked back up at the empty sky. The first bad reading came back at 7:18 in the morning while I was standing above the cliffs near St. Abb's Head. I worked as a coastal surveyor for an engineering firm in Edinburgh. Most of my job involved checking erosion, measuring rock faces, and updating models for paths, drainage, and seawalls. I used a tripod-mounted laser rangefinder that could measure surfaces several hundred meters away, as long as there was something solid for the beam to hit. That morning was cold and bright. Rain had passed before dawn, and the air was unusually clear. The sea was rough from the night's weather, but the wind on the headland had dropped. Low sunlight came from behind me and lit the cliff faces across the bay. My name was Graham Ellis. I was 41 then, and had been doing survey work for nearly 16 years. I knew the equipment well enough to tell the difference between a bad reflection and a real return. I was measuring a section of cliff where a crack had opened near the coastal path. The first few readings were normal: 112 meters to the lower ledge, 148 to the dark band of rock beneath it, 206 to a point near the waterline. Then I aimed out over the sea by mistake and got a distance of 83 meters. The beam should have returned nothing. There was only open air between me and the water, and the sea surface was more than 100 meters below. I thought I had clipped the edge of the cliff. I shifted the rangefinder slightly to the right and tried again. 85 meters. I moved farther right. 88. The readings changed smoothly, as though the laser was traveling across a curved surface. I looked through the optical sight. There was nothing there. Blue-gray sky filled the upper half of the view. The sea moved far below. No mist, bird, cable, or aircraft crossed the beam. I cleaned the lens and checked the calibration marker on my case. The rangefinder measured it correctly. Then I aimed at the empty air again. 91 meters. I lowered the tripod and walked several meters along the cliff path. From the new position, the return changed to 76 meters. That should not have happened if the beam was reflecting off the distant sea. The distance would have remained much greater. I moved again and took another reading. 72. It felt like I was walking closer to something I could not see. A gull passed through the area between me and the supposed surface. The rangefinder briefly returned 34 meters, which was probably the bird. Then it changed back to 72 after the gull cleared. That meant the invisible return sat beyond the gull, but well above the sea. I marked my position with a small flag and started taking readings in a grid. The measurements formed a shape. It was roughly oval, maybe 40 meters long and 20 meters high. The nearest part hovered about 60 meters from the cliff edge. The surface curved away on both sides and seemed to hang at a slight angle, with the lower end pointing toward the water. Nothing was visible inside the measured area. I could see distant cloud through it. The only visual difference was a faint shimmer around the lower edge, similar to heat above a road, but the morning air was cold. I called my colleague Megan Shaw, who was working near the car park about half a mile inland. I told her the rangefinder was producing false returns over the sea. She asked whether I had checked the lens. I said yes. She told me to restart the unit and wait for her. I switched it off, removed the battery, waited, and started again. The first reading came back at 68 meters. The surface had moved closer. I stepped away from the tripod. A flock of kittiwakes rose from the rocks below. They came up in a loose group, calling loudly as they circled the cliff. When they reached the empty area, the front birds dropped, not dived. They were forced downward. Their wings stayed spread, and they beat hard, but something pushed them toward the sea. The birds behind them broke formation and turned away. One kittiwake reached the lower edge of the measured oval. Its body tilted sharply. For a second, it seemed to slide along an invisible curve. Then it fell free and recovered below it. The flock scattered toward the rocks. I looked through the sight again. The shimmer had become stronger. A narrow section of mist formed along the lower edge, even though the air around it remained clear. The mist traced a smooth line for several seconds and then disappeared. I raised the rangefinder. 64 meters. The thing was still coming closer. Megan arrived carrying a second tripod and a handheld unit. She thought I had found an atmospheric reflection until I showed her the grid. She took her own readings. Her first one returned 62 meters. Her second gave 63. She moved left and got 67. Her expression changed. "What's out there?" she asked. I told her I did not know. We set up both instruments several meters apart and measured at the same time. The distances matched within a few centimeters. That ruled out a fault in my unit. Megan aimed above the shape. No return. She aimed below it toward the sea. 139 meters. Then she moved the laser back to the center. 59 meters. The surface had risen and moved closer. We could tell because the lower boundary now sat higher in the sky. I had to tilt the rangefinder upward by nearly 2 degrees to catch it. Megan suggested a weather balloon or large sheet of clear plastic. Neither explanation fit. A balloon would have been visible against the sky. Plastic large enough to produce those readings would have moved in the wind and reflected sunlight. This surface remained perfectly still. I took out my phone and recorded the area. The camera showed empty sky. When I zoomed in, the focus pulsed repeatedly, as if it could not decide whether the subject was near or far. A low clicking sound came from offshore. 3 light clicks, a pause, then 2. Megan heard it too. It did not sound like a bird or something striking rock. The noise had no echo, even with the cliffs around us. The clicking repeated slightly higher. The invisible surface had risen again. A larger group of seabirds came from the north, flying low along the cliff. They reached the area beneath it and dropped together. Some fell nearly 20 meters before escaping sideways. Their calls became sharp and frantic. One bird was pushed close to the water but managed to turn toward shore. Megan said, "It's pressing the air down." That was what it looked like. The sea directly below the shape had changed too. Waves moving into that section flattened slightly, then returned to normal after passing through. Foam spread into long, straight lines. The effect moved with the invisible surface. I checked the time. 7:41. My phone showed 7:46. I assumed my watch had lost a few minutes. Megan's phone showed 7:46 as well. We called our supervisor, Alan Robson. I tried to explain that both instruments were measuring an unseen surface above the cliffs. He asked if there was fog. I said no. He told us to stop taking measurements and return to the vehicles. He was worried about unstable ground after the rain. Neither of us wanted to leave without seeing where the surface went. We moved back from the cliff edge and continued tracking it. The measurements showed the lower end rising steadily. The nearest distance stayed between 55 and 60 meters, as if the object moved upward around us instead of simply climbing. The shape also seemed to rotate. The long axis had been almost horizontal. Over the next 5 minutes, it tilted until one end pointed toward the sky. The curved returns remained smooth. No seams, gaps, or irregularities appeared. Megan mapped the points on her tablet. The software drew a pale wireframe oval hanging above the sea. Seeing it on the screen made the situation worse. The model looked solid and simple, like something that should have been obvious to the eye. But when we looked up, there was nothing there. The clicking returned. This time it came through the rangefinders. Both units made the sound from their internal speakers, even though they had no alert programmed with that pattern. 3 clicks, a pause, 2. The displays went blank. A pressure change passed over the headland. My ears blocked. Loose grass flattened around our boots, all pointing toward the sea. The air smelled faintly metallic. The invisible surface began moving toward the cliffs. We knew from the readings, not from sight. The distances dropped quickly. 50 meters, 46, 41. Megan told me to move. We grabbed the equipment and backed toward the inland side of the path. A thin cloud bank approached from the west. It was high and narrow, stretched like a long white strip. When it reached the empty area, the cloud bent around it. The vapor divided cleanly along a curved boundary. For the first time, we could see the full outline. It was much larger than the model suggested. The upper part extended beyond the section we had measured, like maybe 70 meters long. It stood almost upright above the water, with one side close to the cliff. The cloud slid around a smooth oval shape and joined again behind it. Several darker patches appeared inside the outline. They were not windows exactly. They looked like places where the cloud became thin and gray. One patch moved. A narrow shadow crossed from one side to the other and stopped near the center. Megan lowered the tablet. "Did you see that?" I said yes. The pressure in my ears became painful. The rock beneath us gave a low vibration. Pebbles rolled from the path toward the cliff edge, even though the ground sloped slightly inland. The rangefinder in my hand switched on by itself. The display showed 29 meters, then 24, then 20. The surface was almost over us. We ran toward the old lookout wall. The cloud outline moved with us, not fast, but fast enough to keep the same position offshore. The birds below had stopped calling. Hundreds of them sat on the water or clung to the cliff ledges, all facing away from the empty space. The vibration deepened. A metal fence post beside the path began humming. Megan's radio crackled. A voice said her first name. Megan. It sounded like Alan, but slower and flatter. She answered automatically. There was no reply. My radio said, Graham. The voice sounded like Megan. She had not spoken. We switched the radios off. The names repeated once more through the dead speakers. The cloud continued wrapping around the shape. Its lower edge cleared the cliff top. Nothing touched the ground, but frost formed in an oval patch across the grass, even though the temperature was above freezing. The frost spread toward us. We moved behind the stone lookout wall. The rangefinder gave one final reading, 11 meters. Then every display went black. A bright flash came from inside the cloud. There was no thunder. The whole headland turned white for less than a second. I could see the wall, grass, fence, and Megan as black outlines. Something large passed overhead. I did not see it directly. I saw the sky bend. Clouds stretched across a long oval area and snapped back after it moved. The pressure wave forced us both to crouch. Then the vibration stopped. Normal wind returned. The seabirds lifted from the water all at once and flew inland. The cloud band continued east in a straight line. No outline remained. Our equipment restarted. Every reading returned open-air errors. The invisible surface had gone. My watch showed 7:44. My phone showed 8:01. Megan's tablet had stopped recording at 7:43 and resumed at 8:00. Neither of us remembered 17 minutes passing. We packed the gear and returned to the vehicles. Alan arrived before we left. He checked both instruments and found nothing wrong. We showed him the survey model. The points formed a smooth oval surface, but the software listed the coordinates as below sea level. That contradicted where we had aimed. The phone videos showed clouds bending slightly, though the main outline was difficult to see. The audio recorded the clicking. It did not record our radios saying our names. The official explanation from the equipment supplier was multipath reflection caused by moisture and the angle of the sea. I asked how two instruments from different positions could build the same moving surface in clear air. They did not answer that part. A week later, Megan and I returned with a drone. The weather was cloudy and windy. We found no strange readings. The birds behaved normally. Near the lookout wall, a clean oval patch interrupted the salt and dirt on a metal information sign. It was about 40 centimeters long with smooth edges. The rest of the sign felt cold. The oval patch was warm. Megan touched it with the handheld rangefinder. The unit displayed a distance of 11 meters. The laser pointed into empty air above the cliff. A flock of gulls rose from the rocks below. They reached the space in front of us and dropped together, wings beating hard. The rangefinder clicked 3 times. After a pause, it clicked twice. High above the sea, a narrow strip of cloud bent around something we could not see. The first thing I noticed was that turbine 14 had stopped with one blade pointing almost straight down. I was about half a mile away when I saw it. I had been driving the service track between rows, heading up toward the North Ridge, and every turbine around it was turning at the same slow speed. The wind had been steady all morning, around 22 miles an hour, strong enough to shake the mirrors on the truck. Turbine 14 was the only one standing still. I pulled over and watched it for maybe 30 seconds. The nacelle was facing the right direction. The other 2 blades were angled normally. There was no smoke, no loose panel, nothing hanging off it. It just looked like somebody had paused it. My name was Daniel Mercer. At the time, I worked for a maintenance contractor in eastern Wyoming. We serviced a wind farm about 40 miles outside Rawlins, past a lot of open land and a few ranches. Most days I worked with another technician, but that week we were short-staffed. My partner, Luis Ortega, had hurt his wrist, so I had been doing basic inspections alone. That morning was cold for late September. The sky was clear over the plains, but a low bank of gray cloud had settled behind the ridge to the west. The wind made the dry grass lie flat in waves. I called the control trailer. 14 is offline, I said. A woman named Erin checked the system. It's not showing offline, she said. I looked at the turbine again. It's definitely not moving. There was a pause while she checked something else. I'm seeing normal output. That can't be right. 6.1 megawatts. No alarms. Turbine 14 was a 3 megawatt unit, so that number made no sense. I asked her to repeat it. She did, then said, "Wait. Sorry, that was the combined reading for 14 and 15. I looked toward turbine 15. It was spinning normally on the other side of the access road. What's 14 showing by itself?" Another pause. 2.8. The blade still had not moved. I told her I was going up to check it. She asked me to wait while she shut it down remotely. I stayed in the truck and watched the tower. About a minute later, Erin said the brake had engaged. Nothing changed visually because the rotor was already still. I drove the rest of the way and parked at the base. The tower made the usual low humming sound, which bothered me. A stopped turbine should have been quieter. This one sounded loaded, like the generator was working. I walked around the base and looked up. The downward blade had stopped a few feet above the ground at its lowest point. From where I stood, I could see dirt and bug marks along the leading edge. Nothing looked damaged. There was also a clicking sound. It came every 4 or 5 seconds from somewhere inside the tower. Not a loud click, more like a relay switching. I unlocked the access door and stepped inside. The tower was dark except for the emergency lights. The air smelled like warm metal and hydraulic fluid. The clicking was clearer inside. It seemed to come from above me, but sounds traveled strangely through those towers. I checked the base cabinet. The display showed the rotor speed as 11 revolutions per minute. I stared at it for a while. Outside, the blades had not moved. I called Erin again and told her what I was seeing. "That's probably a frozen value," she said. "The power reading, too? Could be a communication fault." I asked her if any other units were acting strange. She said no. I reset the local panel. The display went dark, restarted, then returned to the same reading, 11 revolutions per minute. Output fluctuating between 2.7 and 2.9 megawatts. I opened the door and looked out again, still motionless. The clicking stopped. For a few seconds there was no sound inside the tower at all. Then I heard something scrape across the outside of the door. I stepped back. It was a slow sound, like a branch dragging over metal, except there were no trees or bushes near the tower. The nearest tall grass was 15 feet away. I opened the door quickly. Nothing was there. The grass around the concrete pad was moving hard in the wind. Dust blew along the road. My truck sat where I had left it. I walked around the tower again. There were no marks on the door. When I came back inside, the display showed 0 revolutions per minute. The power output had dropped to 0 too. I told Erin the readings had corrected themselves. She asked me to inspect the nacelle and check the rotor lock system. I put on my harness and started climbing. The elevator had been out of service for 2 days, so I had to use the ladder. It was around 300 feet to the top. I had made that climb plenty of times, but something felt wrong almost immediately. Normally, you could feel the tower flex slightly in strong wind. You would hear creaks through the ladder rails and a low vibration through your boots. That day, the tower felt completely rigid. I stopped at the first rest platform and put my hand against the wall. No vibration. The wind outside was still strong enough to roar around the tower, but the metal under my hand felt dead. I climbed another section. About halfway up, my radio made a short burst of noise. I thought Erin was calling me, so I answered. There was another burst, followed by what sounded like someone breathing close to a microphone. "Erin?" No response. Then I heard my own voice say, "14 is offline." It was the exact sentence I had used earlier. The transmission cut out. I clipped onto the ladder and waited. My radio had picked up repeats before, usually from the system bouncing signals between towers, but I had never heard one that clearly. I called the control trailer. Erin answered normally. I asked if she had replayed my earlier transmission. No, she said. We don't even have playback on this channel. I told her I had probably picked up another crew. There's nobody else on site, she said. I did not like that answer, so I stopped talking about it. I kept climbing. Near the top, I started hearing the clicking again. This time it came from inside the nacelle above me. It was faster now. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause. When I reached the hatch, the sound stopped. I opened it and climbed into the nacelle. Everything looked normal at first. The lights were on, the hydraulic pressure was in range, the brake assembly showed engaged, the gearbox temperature was a little high, but not enough to trigger an alarm. The main shaft was still. I moved past it toward the rear cabinet. That was when I noticed the dust. The floor inside a nacelle was never clean. There was always fine grit, grease, and flakes of paint. Across the dusty walkway were 3 dark marks, each about the size of a hand. They started near the rear access panel and ended beside the gearbox. They did not look like boot prints. They were oval and smooth with no tread pattern. The spacing between them was uneven. The first 2 were close together. The third was almost 5 feet away. I crouched and touched one. The dust was damp. I smelled my glove. It had a faint mineral smell like wet concrete. There was no moisture anywhere else inside. I took a few photos with my phone, but the camera kept failing to focus. Every picture came out blurred in the center, even when I held the phone against the railing. I wiped the lens and tried again. Same result. I called Erin and told her I was checking the brake. She asked if I had found anything. Nothing obvious. I did not mention the marks. I already felt foolish about the radio. I released and re-engaged the brake manually. The pressure changed the way it should. The rotor never moved. Then the whole nacelle gave one hard shudder. It was not the normal movement from a gust. It felt like something had struck the rear of the housing. I grabbed the railing. A second impact came from below. The floor jumped under my boots. I called Erin. Did you just command anything? No. Did the tower register movement? No. Why? I told her I had felt 2 impacts. She said there had been no vibration alarms. I stood still and listened. The wind noise outside had changed. It no longer sounded like air moving around the nacelle. It had become a steady, low tone, almost like blowing across the mouth of a bottle. I climbed onto the small external platform at the rear. The platform was enclosed by rails and gave a clear view over the ridge. From that height, I could see rows of turbines running south and east. Every one of them was turning. Turbine 14 remained still beneath me. I checked the blade positions from above. Nothing was caught in the hub. There was no visible damage. Then I looked west. Something dark was holding position beyond the ridge. At first, I thought it was a helicopter seen from below. It was about level with me, maybe a mile away, though judging distance out there was difficult. It looked oval, wider than it was tall. It had no visible tail, rotors, wings, or lights. It was not moving with the wind. The cloud bank behind it made the shape easy to see. It was darker than the clouds, almost black, with a thin gray edge along the bottom. I watched it for several seconds, waiting for it to turn or drift. It stayed fixed in one spot. I called Erin again. There's something west of the ridge. What kind of something? Maybe an aircraft. She asked for a direction and altitude. I gave her my best estimate. She checked with the site office, then said there were no scheduled flights in the area. The object seemed to tilt slightly. When it did, the low tone around the nacelle became louder. I felt pressure in my ears, like during a fast elevator ride. I swallowed, but it did not clear. The other turbines began changing speed, not stopping, just slowing down together. One after another, the blades across the western row lost speed until they were barely turning. The eastern row kept moving normally. I asked Erin if she was seeing a wind drop. No, she said. Wind speed is steady. Look at the western row. There was a pause. They're showing normal. They're slowing down. Everything is within range. The dark shape moved sideways. It did not bank or turn. It just slid to the right, keeping the same orientation. The low sound followed it. I felt the platform rail vibrating under my hand, not shaking from wind, vibrating at a steady frequency. My radio crackled. This time I heard Luis. He said my name twice. Daniel, Daniel. Luis was at home in Casper with his wrist in a brace. I answered without thinking. Luis? The voice said, come down. Then it repeated, come down. The tone was wrong. The words sounded flat and clipped as if they had been taken from separate recordings. I switched off the radio. The dark oval stopped moving. It was closer to the ridge now, though I had not seen it approach. A small section of the ridgeline seemed distorted underneath it. The ground looked bent, like heat shimmer, but the air was cold. I backed toward the hatch. Before I climbed inside, I looked down at my truck. The driver's door was open. I was certain I had closed it. I always locked the truck because loose doors could be damaged by the wind. I could not see anyone near it. I climbed into the nacelle and shut the hatch. The clicking started again immediately. It came from the rear cabinet. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause. The cabinet held communications equipment and control relays. I opened it and checked the status lights. Several were flashing in sequence from top to bottom. I had never seen that pattern. My phone showed no service, which was normal, but the clock had stopped changing. It read 11:17. I watched it for close to a minute, still 11:17. I opened the stopwatch app and started it. The numbers did not move. I turned the screen off and back on. The time remained 11:17. The clicking stopped. A second later, the main shaft rotated a few inches. The brake was still engaged. I stepped away from it. The shaft moved again, slower this time, forcing against the brake. Metal groaned somewhere inside the hub. I reached for the emergency stop, even though it was already active. The lights went out. I stood in complete darkness, hearing the brake strain against the shaft. Then something moved across the roof. It traveled from the rear of the nacelle toward the hub in a series of soft, heavy taps. Not footsteps exactly. The spacing was too wide. I crouched beside the cabinet and waited. The movement stopped directly above me. Dust drifted down from a seam in the ceiling. I could hear my breathing, the wind, and a faint rubbing sound from the roof. The rubbing continued for several seconds. Then the nacelle lights came back on. The phone in my hand showed 11:29. The stopwatch read 12 minutes and 4 seconds. I had no sense of 12 minutes passing. It had felt like less than one. The roof was silent. I moved to the hatch and looked outside again. The dark shape was gone. The cloud bank behind the ridge looked normal. At that exact moment, the main shaft began turning. The brake released by itself. The rotor accelerated smoothly, as if the turbine had simply received a normal startup command. I grabbed the radio and turned it on. Erin was calling my name. I answered. "Where have you been?" she asked. "In the nacelle. I've been trying you for 15 minutes. I told her the turbine had restarted. "I know," she said. "It just came back online by itself." I asked if she had sent a start command. "No." "Shut it down." "I'm trying." The shaft kept turning faster. I climbed down as quickly as I safely could. The tower had started vibrating normally again, but the ladder felt like it was swaying more than usual. Halfway down, I heard a scraping sound outside the tower. It kept pace with me for 2 full ladder sections. When I stopped, it stopped. When I continued, it continued. I did not look through the inspection openings. Near the bottom, my radio transmitted on its own. My own voice came through the speaker. It said, "Nothing obvious." That was what I had told Erin inside the nacelle. Then it said, "Come down." I switched it off again. When I reached the base, the tower display showed normal operation. The clicking had stopped. I opened the door and stepped outside. My truck door was closed. It was still locked. I checked the inside. Nothing seemed disturbed, but there was a thin line of damp dirt across the driver's seat. It ran from the door to the center console, as though something wet had been dragged across the fabric. There were no footprints around the truck. I got in and started the engine. Before leaving, I looked up at the turbine. All 3 blades were turning normally. As I drove down the service road, turbines 15 and 16 slowed behind me. I watched them in the mirror. They did not stop completely. They just turned more slowly than the others, matching the speed of my truck for a while. At the bottom of the ridge, my phone connected to the network. I called Luis. He answered after a few rings. I asked if he had tried to reach me. "No," he said. "Why?" I asked him to say my name. He laughed. "What are you talking about?" "Just say it. Daniel." His voice sounded normal. It sounded nothing like the radio transmission, even though I had recognized it immediately at the time. I told him it was nothing and ended the call. I made it back to the control trailer around noon. Aaron showed me the system logs. According to the records, turbine 14 had never stopped. It had produced power continuously, except for a 12-minute communications gap starting at 11:17. During that same gap, the wind sensor on 14 had recorded 0 miles per hour. Every other sensor nearby had recorded wind between 21 and 24. The photos on my phone were mostly blurred, but one of them showed the floor inside the nacelle clearly. The dark oval marks were gone. In their place was a single streak of damp dust leading toward the rear access panel. At the far end of the streak, partly hidden by the cabinet, there was a narrow shape that looked like the edge of something black. I returned to the site 2 days later with another technician named Owen Price. We opened the rear access panel and checked every space behind it. There was nothing inside except wiring and insulation. The panel was dry. On the outside of the nacelle, directly above the communications cabinet, Owen found 3 shallow dents in the roof. They were smooth and oval. He asked me if a tool had fallen on it during a previous service. I said I did not know. We finished the inspection and climbed down before the afternoon wind picked up. As we were driving away, Owen looked back at turbine 14. "Did they stop that one again?" he asked. I checked the mirror. One blade was pointing almost straight down. The other turbines kept turning. We drove another 100 yards before it started moving. I found the extra photograph when I picked up the prints from the pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon. The roll had been sitting in my kitchen drawer for almost 3 weeks. I had taken it during a family picnic at Lake Needwood in Maryland, back when I was still using a little Olympus point and shoot instead of my phone. The camera was old but reliable. You slid the cover open, pressed the button, and it handled everything else. There should have been 24 pictures on the roll. The packet had 25. At first, I assumed the clerk had mixed in somebody else's print. It happened sometimes. The extra photo showed a wooden picnic table in a clearing, surrounded by patchy grass and tall trees. There was a red cooler under the bench and a folded blue blanket near one of the legs. It took me a few seconds to recognize the table. It was ours. The picture had been taken from above, maybe 20 or 30 feet in the air. The camera seemed to be angled almost straight down. The table was empty. Nobody was sitting around it. The paper plates and food containers had been packed away. The parking area at the edge of the frame was empty too. The strange part was that I remembered exactly where I had left the camera. It had been sitting on the table. My name is Laura Keene. I was 38 at the time, living in Rockville with my husband, Ben, and our 2 daughters, Molly and Paige. The picnic had been for my father's 67th birthday. My parents came, my brother Eric came with his wife and son, and my aunt Denise drove down from Frederick. It had been a normal Sunday afternoon in early October. Cool, but not cold. The sky stayed cloudy most of the day, and there was a light wind coming off the lake. We grilled burgers, cut a grocery store cake, and let the kids run around near the trees. I remembered taking pictures all afternoon. My father opening his cards, Molly holding a caterpillar on a stick, Eric pretending to drop the cake. A blurry one of Ben carrying the cooler back to the car. The final picture I remembered taking was of my parents standing near the table. After that, I put the camera down beside my purse while we cleaned up. I checked the prints in order. Picture 23 showed Ben and Eric folding the portable chairs. Picture 24 showed my parents beside the table, both looking tired and smiling. Picture 25 showed the empty clearing from above. There was no sign of the camera's strap hanging in front of the lens. There was no blur, no finger over the corner, and no reflection suggesting that the picture had been taken through glass. I flipped it over. The printing timestamp was the same as the others because they had all been processed together. But the little exposure number said 25A. The photo of my parents said 24A. I called the pharmacy. The clerk who answered sounded about 16. I explained that I had received an extra print and asked if it could have come from another roll. He said the images were printed automatically from the negatives, so if it was in my packet, it had probably been on my film. Could the machine make a duplicate? I asked. Maybe, he said, but it would be the same picture. I asked whether they still had the negatives. He said they were in the envelope. I had not noticed them tucked behind the receipt. I held the strip up to the kitchen window. The last frame was there. Tiny, but clearly the same overhead view. Ben came home around 6. I put the photograph on the counter and asked him where he thought it had been taken from. He looked at it for a few seconds. A drone? We didn't have a drone. I know, it looks like a drone picture. I told him it was from the picnic roll. He frowned and brought it closer to the light. Did Eric take the camera? No. You sure? Yes. I was sure because I had been the one who found it when we left. That part had bothered me as soon as I saw the picture. We packed up around 5. My parents left first, then Denise, then Eric and his family. Ben took Molly and Paige to the restroom near the parking lot, while I did one last check around the table. The camera was underneath the table, close to the center support. I had assumed it had fallen. I remembered crouching down and seeing the silver body in the grass. The wrist strap was wrapped once around the metal crossbar under the tabletop. It took me a moment to pull it loose. I had not mentioned that to anyone because it did not seem important. When I told Ben, he said maybe one of the kids had moved it. Molly and Paige were already at the restroom. Eric's kid then. Maybe. But Eric's son was 4. The camera would have been difficult for him to reach under the middle of the table, and the strap had been looped neatly around the crossbar. Ben examined the picture again. There might have been somebody in a tree. The trees around the clearing were mature oaks and maples, but none leaned directly over the table. The closest branches were probably 15 feet to one side. I called Eric. I tried to sound casual. I asked whether he had used my camera after the picture of Mom and Dad. No, he said. Why? I said there was a strange photo on the roll. He asked me to send it to him, so I scanned it and emailed it. A few minutes later, he called back. That's the picnic area, he said. I know. Who took it? That's what I'm asking. He thought Denise might have picked up the camera as a joke. Denise said she had not touched it. My father said the same thing. My mother did not remember seeing the camera after the group pictures. I asked everyone separately whether they had noticed anybody else near the clearing while we were packing. They all said no. For a while, that was the whole mystery. I put the photograph back in the envelope and left it in the kitchen drawer. Then I noticed the time. The negatives had a faint date and time imprint along the edge. I needed a magnifying glass to read it. The photo of my parents had been taken at 4:52 p.m. The overhead photograph had been taken at 5:11. By 5:11, everyone had left the picnic area. I knew because Ben had saved the parking receipt from the exit booth. It showed 5:07. We had pulled out 4 minutes before the photograph was taken. The park road between the picnic area and the booth was short. There was no way we were still parked nearby at 5:11. I checked the camera clock in case it was wrong. It was 2 minutes slow, but the gap between the final pictures would still have been 19 minutes. Ben said the shutter might have gone off while the camera was lying under the table. I placed the camera beneath our dining table and took a picture. It showed chair legs and the underside of the tabletop. Nothing like the print. Then I put it on the floor with the lens facing up and took another picture using the timer. That one showed the ceiling. The picnic photograph had the entire table centered in the frame, along with several yards of ground on every side. It could only have been taken from well above it. I started looking more carefully at the image. The red cooler under the bench belonged to my parents. My father had carried it to their car before they left. It should not have been in the photograph. I called him. He said he remembered putting the cooler in his trunk. He even remembered Denise complaining that it had leaked melted ice on the ground. I asked if he was sure it was the red one. We only have one cooler, he said. I opened picture 23. The red cooler was visible under the table while the chairs were being folded. In picture 24, it was gone. In picture 25, it was back. I showed Ben. He stared at both photos side by side. That could be something else, he said. It has the white lid and the gray handle. I see that. Dad had already taken it. I hear you. He used that calm voice people use when they think you are getting worked up. I dropped the subject. A few days later, my mother called and asked whether the blue blanket had been left at the park. I told her it was in the overhead photograph. She was quiet. What overhead photograph? I reminded her that I had emailed a copy to everyone. She said she had not looked closely. The blanket was in my car, she said. I found it under the birthday gifts. I asked if she might have had two blankets. She said no. My grandmother had made that one. It had a small patch sewn into the corner where a dog had torn it years earlier. I looked at the photograph. Even from above, I could see a lighter square near one corner. I began to feel uncomfortable having the picture in the house, not frightened exactly, more like I had brought home something private that I was not meant to see. I put the print and negatives in a manila envelope and stored them in the desk in our guest room. That night, the camera fired by itself. I heard the motor advance while I was brushing my teeth. It was a familiar sound, a quick mechanical whir from the hallway closet where I kept it. I opened the closet. The camera was on the top shelf beside a stack of towels. Its cover was closed, which should have switched it off. I picked it up. The frame counter had moved from 0 to 1. There was no film inside. I opened the back to check anyway. Empty. Ben said the mechanism was probably failing because the camera was old. I wanted to believe that, so I put it in a box in the basement. 2 mornings later, I found it on the guest room desk. It was sitting on top of the manila envelope. I called for Ben and asked if he had moved it. He had not. Molly and Paige both denied touching it. Neither of them liked going into the basement because of the spiders. I checked the box downstairs. The lid was still closed. The folded towel I had placed over the camera was still inside, pressed into the shape of it. That was when I threw the camera away. I put it in the outdoor trash bin the night before collection. I watched the truck empty the bin the next morning. The photograph stayed in the desk. About a week passed without anything happening. Then the park office called me. A man named Howard said one of their employees had found an item near Picnic Area 7. My phone number had been written on a label inside the case. I asked what kind of item. A camera, he said. I did not answer for a moment. He described the Olympus. Silver body, black sliding cover, blue nylon strap. I told him that was impossible because I had thrown it away. He laughed politely like he thought I was making a joke. It was under the table, he said. Pretty well hidden, actually. I asked when they had found it. That morning. The picnic had been nearly a month earlier. I asked if the camera looked damaged. No. A little damp. I did not want it back, but I also did not want it sitting at the park with my number inside. I drove there after work. It was a gray afternoon, colder than the day of the picnic. There were only a few cars in the lot. The trees had lost most of their leaves. Howard gave me the camera in a clear plastic bag. There was dirt along the bottom and moisture inside the viewfinder. The strap had a dark stain across it. Where exactly was it? I asked. He pointed toward the picnic area through the office window. Under the table support. The strap was looped around the crossbar. I asked who found it. One of the grounds crew, Marlin. Could I speak to him? Howard called him on the radio. Marlin arrived a few minutes later in a green park jacket. He seemed confused by my questions, but answered them. He said he noticed the camera because he had been replacing a loose board on the table. It wasn't lying there, he said. It was hanging. From the strap? Yeah, right in the middle underneath. I asked if there had been anything else unusual around the table. He looked toward Howard before answering. There were marks in the dirt. What kind of marks? Just pressed down spots. Footprints? No. He held his hands about 2 feet apart. Round areas, 3 or 4 of them. Howard interrupted and said they were probably from the legs of maintenance equipment. Marlin nodded, but he did not look convinced. I took the camera home because I did not know what else to do with it. Ben was angry when he saw it. Not at me exactly, more at the situation. He put on rubber gloves and opened the back. There was a roll of film inside. The frame counter showed 1. I had not loaded it. The film was a different brand than I normally used. Plain white label, black letters, no box. Ben said we should take it to the police. I asked what we were supposed to report. Someone had found my old camera in a public park. Nothing had been stolen. Nobody had threatened us. We left it on the kitchen counter overnight. In the morning, the frame counter showed 2. The camera had not moved. Ben taped the sliding cover shut and put the camera in a locked metal toolbox in the garage. The next morning, the frame counter showed 3. The tape had not been broken. For the next 4 days, it advanced 1 frame each night. We could hear it sometimes. A faint click from the garage, followed by the motor. Ben unplugged the garage door opener and kept the toolbox key in his pocket. It did not make a difference. When the counter reached 8, I told him I wanted the film developed. He did not like that idea, but he drove with me to a small photography shop in Bethesda. I told the man behind the counter that the camera might have water damage and asked him to remove the film carefully. He opened it inside a light-proof changing bag. "There's no film in here," he said. I thought he was joking. He turned the empty camera toward us. The frame counter still showed 8. We drove home without speaking much. That evening, I opened the guest room desk and took out the original overhead photograph. There was something new in it. At the edge of the clearing, partly hidden beneath the shadow of a tree, stood a person. The figure was small because of the height of the photograph. It wore something pale and appeared to be looking up toward the camera. I called Ben into the room. He saw it too. We compared the print with the scanned copy I had emailed to Eric. The scanned version showed only grass in that spot. Ben placed the photograph face down. The next morning, it was face up again. The figure was closer to the table. It stood beside the red cooler, one arm resting on the white lid. There were no features I could make out. The head looked lowered, but the face was a smooth blur. We sealed the photograph and negatives in a freezer bag and drove them to my parents' house. My father put the bag inside his gun safe. Nothing else happened at our house after that. A month later, my father called and asked me to come over alone. The photograph was on his dining room table. He said the safe had remained locked and nobody else knew the combination. The image had changed again. The table was still empty. The cooler and blanket were gone. The pale figure stood directly beneath the camera, looking straight up. One hand was raised toward the lens. In the grass beside the table, the silver camera lay exactly where I remembered finding it, with the blue strap looped around the metal support. My father asked whether he should burn the picture. I said yes. He carried it to the fireplace with a pair of kitchen tongs. The paper curled and blackened. The image disappeared into a patch of orange flame. We watched until nothing remained except gray ash. Then my father opened the safe. The freezer bag was still inside. The negatives were there. So was the photograph. The table was empty again, viewed from high above. Near the center of the image, just below the tabletop, a pale hand reached out from the shadow. The radar return appeared just after 2 in the morning, coming in low from the north and heading straight toward runway 4. I was alone in the customs office when I noticed it. The airport only handled a few international flights each week, mostly private charters and small cargo planes, so the customs desk stayed closed overnight unless something had been arranged in advance. I was there because a delayed medical flight from Winnipeg was supposed to arrive around 3. My name was Martin Hale. I had worked at Crossfield Regional Airport in northern Maine for 6 years. It was the kind of place with 1 terminal, 2 runways, a small control room, and a maintenance shed that always smelled like diesel. The longer runway was used for passenger and cargo traffic. Runway 4 had not been used in almost 8 years because the pavement was cracked near the south end. The weather was bad that night. Freezing rain tapped against the terminal windows, and fog sat low over the field. Visibility was under a mile. The wind was light, but the temperature kept dropping, and ice was forming on the parked vehicles outside. The control room was normally staffed until midnight. After that, pilots used the common traffic frequency, and runway lights could be activated by clicking their radio microphones a certain number of times. At 2:07, I walked upstairs to check the weather screen. The radar display was still running even though the controller had left. Most of the screen was empty. The medical flight had not entered range yet. A small green mark appeared near the top edge. It had no call sign beside it. No altitude. No speed. That was not unusual by itself. Small aircraft sometimes showed up without full information, especially if their equipment was old or not working correctly. What caught my attention was how steadily it moved. It came south in a perfectly straight line. I watched it for about a minute, expecting it to turn toward the active runway. It did not. It lined up with runway 4. I checked the flight schedule taped beside the console. Nothing was due except the medical flight. I checked the computer log too. No private arrival, no maintenance aircraft, no military notice. I picked up the radio microphone. Unidentified aircraft approaching Crossfield Regional, state your call sign and intentions. There was no answer. The return moved closer. I tried again. Aircraft north of Crossfield, you are aligned with a closed runway. Runway 4 is not available. Acknowledge. The speaker gave a brief crackle. Then I heard 3 soft clicks. They were not microphone clicks like a pilot activating runway lights. They sounded more like someone tapping a fingernail against the microphone itself. The runway lights came on. I could see them through the control room windows. 2 rows of white lights appeared in the fog, stretching away from the terminal toward the trees. Runway 4 had not been powered in years. Maintenance had disconnected the lighting circuit after water kept getting into the junction boxes. I stared at them for several seconds before calling Nolan Briggs, the airport operations manager. He answered, sounding half asleep. "The lights on 4 just came on," I said. "What lights?" "The runway lights." There was a pause. 4 doesn't have working lights. "I'm looking at them." He asked if maintenance was on site. I told him no. The radar returned past the outer marker and began slowing. There was still no altitude shown, but the system displayed a descending symbol beside it. I called the aircraft again. No response. The 3 tapping sounds came through the speaker once more. This time they were followed by a low tone. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. It did not sound like engine noise or radio interference. It was smooth and steady, almost too clean, and I felt it in the desk more than I heard it. The radar return moved over the beginning of runway 4, then it stopped. It did not vanish. It stayed in one spot, directly above the runway. I looked through the window. The fog was thick, but the runway lights were bright enough to show the pavement. I saw no aircraft, no landing lights, no shadow moving through the mist. I turned off the control room lights to reduce the reflection in the glass. Nothing was there. The radar mark remained motionless. I called Nolan again and told him what I was seeing. He said he was driving in. I asked him to call the sheriff's office on the way. He said he would, but he sounded doubtful, like he thought I had made a mistake with the equipment. I went downstairs and stepped into the terminal lobby. The automatic doors were locked, but the outer vestibule lights were on. Beyond the glass, the parking lot was empty except for my car and 2 airport trucks. A scraping sound came from the roof. It moved from one end of the terminal to the other, slow and uneven. I thought it was ice sliding off, but nothing fell past the windows. The sound stopped above the customs office. Then the phone rang. It was the internal line, not an outside call. The display showed Gate 2. Gate 2 had not been used in months. The jet bridge had been removed and the door was sealed with a metal barrier. I answered, "Customs." There was no voice. I heard wind and a faint clicking noise. 3 clicks. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Gate 2. I let it ring. The runway lights outside stayed on. I went back upstairs and checked the radar. The return had started moving again, but not down the runway. It was drifting sideways toward the terminal, very slowly. The system showed a speed of 6 knots. I tried the radio once more. "The unidentified aircraft, if you can hear this transmission, turn away from the terminal and hold position." The green mark stopped. A second return appeared beside it. It was smaller and very faint. Then a third appeared. All 3 were close together. I looked outside again. There was still nothing visible above the runway, but the fog had begun moving in a strange way. It was pulling inward from both sides, forming a clear strip over the center line. The runway lights looked sharp inside that opening. The clear strip extended toward the terminal. It stopped about 100 feet from the building. I heard a noise from the baggage room below. A heavy metallic knock, followed by another one. I carried a flashlight and went downstairs. The baggage room connected to the secure customs inspection area. Nobody should have been inside. I unlocked the door and opened it a few inches. The conveyor belt was running. Bags only entered through that room when a flight arrived. The system had to be switched on manually from a panel beside the loading door. The belt moved slowly, empty, except for a thin layer of water. Droplets covered the rubber surface. They gathered near the edge and dripped onto the floor. The loading door at the far end was closed. I stepped inside and shut off the conveyor. It stopped for 2 seconds. Then it started again. The control switch remained in the off position. I backed out and locked the door. When I reached the lobby, the terminal lights dimmed. Every clock on the wall changed to 2:14. There were 4 of them showing different time zones. They all displayed 2:14, including the one labeled London and the one labeled Tokyo. My phone showed 2:14 too. I watched it for close to a minute. The time did not change. The runway lights continued burning outside. A vehicle appeared at the entrance road. I felt relieved until it stopped before reaching the parking lot. Its headlights stayed fixed in the fog. I called Nolan. He answered and said he was still 8 miles away. I asked whether he could see another vehicle ahead of him. No, he said. The headlights outside went dark. There was no sound of an engine. A shape moved between the parking lot and the runway. I could not make out details. It was taller than a person and very narrow, but the fog distorted everything. It crossed behind one of the airport trucks and disappeared. I stayed behind the customs counter and watched the windows. Nothing else moved. Then the radio upstairs activated by itself. I heard it through the ceiling speaker. Crossfield Regional, a voice said. The voice was quiet and broken by static. I could not tell whether it was male or female. I ran upstairs and grabbed the microphone. Aircraft calling Crossfield. Identify yourself. The speaker hissed. Request customs clearance. I looked at the radar. The 3 returns were gone. A new line of information had appeared at the bottom of the screen. Arrival, N0, type, Holloway 9, origin, unlisted, persons, 1. I had never heard of an aircraft called a Holloway 9. I searched the type code database on the control computer. No result. The voice returned. Request customs clearance. I asked for a registration number. There was a long pause. N0, it said. That is not a valid registration. Another pause. Correct. The word came through clearly. I did not know what to say after that. The radar display flickered. For a second, the screen showed a close-up image instead of the normal map. It looked like a grainy overhead view of the airport. The terminal roof was visible in the center. Something dark and oval hovered above runway 4. It had no lights or markings. It was wider than the runway and seemed almost flat from above. The picture vanished before I could move closer. The radar map returned. A new message appeared. Ground contact. 2:14, I looked outside. The clear strip in the fog now reached the terminal. The automatic doors in the lobby opened. They should not have opened while locked. I heard them slide apart downstairs, followed by the alarm chime. Cold air entered the building. I left the control room and leaned over the stairwell railing. The outer and inner doors stood open. No one was in the vestibule. A line of wet marks led from the entrance toward the customs desk. They were not footprints. Each mark was an oval patch about 18 inches long. The next one appeared 4 or 5 feet ahead, then another, as if something was touching the floor at wide intervals. The marks ended at the yellow inspection line. I heard 3 soft taps against the glass wall of the customs booth. I could see the booth from the stairs. Nothing stood beside it. The phone rang again. Gate 2. This time I answered from the upstairs extension. The same quiet voice said, 1 person. I looked at the radar message. Persons. 1. Where are you? I asked. The line went silent. Then the voice said, at the line. I looked down at the yellow line. The wet marks were still there. A small amount of water had collected beside them, but it did not spread across the tile. It stayed in neat dark shapes. I told the voice it could not enter without documents. The response came immediately. Documents are below. Below where? Below the surface. The runway lights flickered. For a moment, I saw a dark object through the terminal windows. It was beyond the parking lot, over runway 4. The fog had thinned enough to show its lower edge. It looked smooth and curved, maybe 30 feet across, but judging size was difficult because I could not tell how far away it was. It did not seem to rest on the runway. It held position a few feet above it. There was no engine sound. The low tone returned through the building. The window glass vibrated. A pen rolled off the customs desk and fell to the floor. The object shifted slightly. As it moved, the runway lights beneath it went out one by one, then came back on after it passed. I heard Nolan on my phone, but I did not remember calling him. He was saying my name. I answered. "I'm at the main gate," he said. "The barrier won't open." "Stay in your truck." "Why?" "Just stay there." He asked what was on the runway. I looked through the glass. "You can see it?" "I can see something blocking the lights." The radio speaker clicked. The quiet voice said, "Additional inspection." The wet marks crossed the yellow line. I watched a new one appear on the other side, closer to the inspection counter. There was no movement between them, no visible foot or object. The mark simply darkened on the tile. Then another appeared. I backed away from the stairwell. The customs computer downstairs turned on. Its login screen lit the empty booth. The document scanner opened and closed. Once. Twice. A receipt began printing. The paper fed out slowly and curled onto the floor. I could hear each line being printed. I went down 2 steps, stopped, and looked toward the runway. The dark object was no longer visible. The fog had closed over it. The radar screen upstairs emitted a warning tone. I returned to the control room. The arrival information had changed. Status, inspection pending. Martin Hale. Clearance required. My full name appeared exactly as it did on my badge. I shut down the radar terminal. The screen went black. A second later, the same words appeared in pale green letters against the dark display. Clearance required. I unplugged the monitor. The message remained. The voice came over the radio again. "Officer Hale?" I did not answer. "Officer Hale." The tone inside the building grew louder. The pressure in my ears became painful. I felt unsteady and had to hold the console. Outside, every runway light shut off except one. The single light was directly across from the terminal. It changed from white to red. The wet marks downstairs resumed. I could hear them now, not as footsteps, but as soft drops hitting the tile. One, a pause, another. They reached the base of the stairs. I took my badge off and placed it on the console. "I am denying clearance," I said into the radio. The low tone stopped. The pressure in my ears released so suddenly that I nearly fell. The voice answered, "Reason. Closed runway, invalid registration, no flight plan, no documents." There was a long stretch of static. Then it said, "Acknowledged." The red runway light turned white. The radar display went blank. All the wet marks downstairs disappeared at once, leaving the floor dry. The clocks changed from 2:14 to 2:25. Exactly 11 minutes had passed. The runway lights switched off. Nolan's truck came through the gate a few seconds later. He entered the terminal with a flashlight and a tire iron. We searched every room together, including the baggage area, Gate 2, the roof access stairs, and the customs inspection booths. Nobody was inside. The conveyor belt had stopped. There was no water on it. The receipt from the customs printer was still on the floor. Most of the paper was blank. Near the bottom, one line had been printed. Arrival refused. Return authorized. Nolan went upstairs and restarted the radar system. The return was gone. The log showed that runway 4's lighting circuit had activated at 2:14 and shut down at 2:25. Maintenance checked the circuit the next morning. The power cable had been physically disconnected since 2018. Both ends were capped inside a locked junction box. The radar log also recorded an arrival. The aircraft type was listed as Holloway 9. The manufacturer field contained no name. The weight, wingspan, and engine fields all showed 0. The registration was N0, which did not exist in any database we could access. The medical flight landed at 3:18 on the active runway. I processed the crew and patient without any problem. After my shift, I drove home in daylight. Freezing rain still covered the roads, and I had to stop twice to clear ice from the wipers. I reached my house around 6, parked in the driveway, and sat in the car for a while before going inside. When I removed my coat, I found my customs badge in the inside pocket. I had left it on the control room console. The front looked normal. On the back, beneath my employee number, a new line had been pressed into the plastic. Clearance officer. I noticed the black dust when I reached the back corner of the roof, just above our bedroom. It was a Saturday morning in late November, and I was cleaning the gutters before the first real freeze. We lived outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a 2-story house on a wooded lot. The weather had been dry for several days, but a cold front was moving in, and the sky had that flat gray look it got before rain. My name was Grant Ellis. I was 41 then. I worked from home doing insurance estimates, and I handled most of the basic house maintenance myself. I had been on that roof plenty of times. At first, I thought the dust was soot. There was a thin black layer along the shingles on the north side, starting near the ridge and continuing down toward the gutter. It did not cover the whole roof. It stopped in a straight line about 4 feet from the chimney, almost as if someone had taped off one section before spreading it. The chimney was on the opposite side. I rubbed some between my fingers. It felt finer than ash and slightly greasy, though it did not leave much color on my skin. When I blew on it, it barely moved. That was strange because the wind had started picking up. Leaves were blowing across the yard, and the trees behind the house were moving enough to make the branches knock together. The dust stayed where it was. I scraped some into an old prescription bottle with the edge of a putty knife. My wife Nadia came outside while I was finishing the gutters. She stood in the driveway and asked if I had found a dead animal. No, I said, just some dirt. She looked up at me. You've been staring at it for 10 minutes. I told her it looked like chimney soot, but was in the wrong place. Could it be from a plane? She asked. We were under a flight path for the regional airport, though most planes passed several miles south of us. I guess. I did not really think that was it. The dust did not look like anything had fallen from the sky. It was too even. The coating was the same thickness across every shingle, including under the raised edges where rain and falling material should not have reached. When I climbed down, I checked the ladder and my shoes. There was no dust on either one. I took the bottle into my garage. I had a cheap digital microscope that I used for checking small electronic parts and coin damage. It connected to my laptop and could magnify things enough to show surface detail. I placed a few grains on a white card and turned on the light. The particles looked round, not perfectly round, but close. Smooth black beads, all about the same size. There were no jagged pieces, no fibers, no flakes. Most household dust looked like a pile of random trash under magnification. Skin, fabric, dirt, hair, bits of insects. This looked manufactured. I measured a few against the microscope scale. Nearly all of them were just under 0.5 millimeter across. I called Nadia into the garage. She leaned over my shoulder and looked at the screen. Those are beads, she said. That's what I thought. From roofing material, I had replaced a section of shingles the previous spring, so I pulled a spare bundle from the corner and scraped off some of the granules. Those were rough, uneven, and gray inside. The black particles were smooth all the way through. I crushed one between 2 metal plates. It flattened slightly but did not break. I put the sample away and went back outside. By then, the rain had started, just a light mist. I stood under the eaves and watched the roof. Water gathered on the clean shingles and ran toward the gutters. On the dusty section, it behaved differently. The drops formed small round beads and stayed in place. Even when enough water collected to move, it ran around the black area instead of through it. Nadia came out and watched too. That isn't normal, she said. I climbed back up before the roof got too wet. I knew it was not a smart thing to do, but I wanted to spray the area with the hose. The water hit the roof and broke apart. It did not wash the dust away. The black layer seemed to tighten against the shingles, becoming darker and more solid. Then I heard a tapping sound. It came from somewhere near the ridge, 3 slow taps, not from inside the attic. It sounded like something touching the roof surface. I turned off the hose and listened. Nothing. I checked around the ridge vent and the flashing. There were no loose branches above that part of the house. The nearest tree was at least 20 feet away. I put my hand on the shingles. They were warm. The rest of the roof was cold from the rain. The black section felt several degrees warmer, enough that I could tell through my work glove. I came down and told Nadia I wanted to call the roofing company. She said we should wait until Monday unless there was a leak. Neither of us wanted to pay an emergency weekend rate, so I agreed. That afternoon, the rain became heavier. The black dust was still visible from our upstairs window. It formed a dark stripe across one slope of the roof, ending directly above the bedroom. Around 4, the lights flickered. The power did not go out. The lamps dimmed and returned to normal. A few seconds later, our dog, Mabel, started barking at the ceiling. She was an 8-year-old hound mix and usually ignored storms. She stood in the hallway with her head tilted up, barking once every few seconds. Nadia called her into the kitchen. Mabel refused to move. I checked the attic access panel in the hall. It was still closed. I pulled down the ladder and went up with a flashlight. The attic smelled normal, dry wood and insulation. Rain tapped against the roof. I walked carefully along the boards toward the north side. The plywood beneath the black section looked darker than the rest. I touched it. Warm, not hot, but warm enough that it should not have been. Outside temperatures were in the low 40s. I held the flashlight close to the wood and saw several small circles in the dust on the attic floor. They were about the size of coins. Each one was perfectly clear inside, as if something round had pressed into the dust without leaving a footprint around it. There were 7 of them. They formed a loose line from the outer wall toward the center of the attic. I took pictures with my phone. As I did, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was directly above me. Tap. A pause. Tap. A longer pause. Tap. The sound moved toward the ridge. I stayed still, listening. It continued over the roof, slow and measured. The spacing was too wide for a squirrel or bird. Each tap was several feet from the last. I climbed down and closed the attic. Nadia had heard it from the hallway. "Branches?" she asked. "There aren't any branches over that part." She looked toward the ceiling. The tapping stopped. That evening, I called my neighbor, Wes Callahan. He had lived on the road for almost 30 years and knew more about construction than I did. I asked if he had ever seen black roofing dust that repelled water. He came over with a flashlight and raincoat. By then it was dark. We stood in the backyard and shone our lights at the roof. The black section looked almost glossy under the beams. Wes stared at it for a while. "That wasn't there last week," he said. I asked how he knew. He said he had been trimming limbs near our fence and had a clear view of the roof. He climbed the ladder far enough to touch the gutter but did not go onto the wet shingles. He rubbed the metal edge with a gloved finger. "There's none in the gutter," he said. That was true. If the dust had washed down, the gutter should have been full of it. Instead, the aluminum was clean. Wes asked if I had found anything in the yard. We checked the grass, deck, windowsills, and air conditioning unit. No black material anywhere. Before leaving, he told me to keep the sample sealed. "Why? I don't know," he said. "I just wouldn't breathe it." That comment stayed with me. I moved the bottle from the garage into a metal toolbox and washed my hands again. We went to bed around 11. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the trees. Wind pushed against the side of the house in short bursts. Mabel would not come into the bedroom. She lay in the hallway facing the attic hatch. I was almost asleep when the tapping started. One tap near the far end of the roof. Then another, closer. It was not loud. It sounded like a knuckle touching a wooden table. Tap. A pause of 4 or 5 seconds. Tap. Nadia sat up. "Is that the roof?" I said yes. The sound moved in a straight line from the back of the house toward our bedroom. Tap. Pause. Tap. Each one came closer to the window. Mabel stood and began whining. I turned on the bedside lamp. The tapping stopped directly above us. We waited. Nothing happened for maybe a minute. Then, there was a soft dragging noise across the shingles. It moved from left to right, slowly, as if something was shifting its weight. Nadia whispered my name. I told her to stay in bed and went into the hallway. Mabel backed away from the attic hatch. The panel lifted slightly, only a fraction of an inch, just enough for a thin dark line to appear around one edge. Then it settled back into place. I grabbed the handle of an old fireplace poker we kept near the stairs. It was a stupid weapon, but I did not own a gun. I pulled down the attic ladder. The space above was dark. I shone my flashlight inside. The circular marks in the dust had changed. There were more of them now. They crossed the attic from the north wall to the hatch. The nearest mark was less than a foot from the opening. I did not climb up. The tapping resumed over the bedroom. This time it came faster. Tap, tap, tap. Not frantic, just closer together. Nadia called from the room that the ceiling light had come on by itself. I went back. The light was glowing very dimly, even though the switch was off. It gave the room a dull yellow color. Our digital alarm clock showed 1:08. The numbers flickered and changed to 1:09, then back to 1:08. My phone showed 1:08 too. I tried calling Wes. The call connected, but I heard no ringing. Instead, I heard the same tapping through the phone speaker. It matched the taps on the roof exactly. I ended the call. The black dust sample was in the garage below us. I suddenly remembered the toolbox and wondered whether the sound was connected to it. I told Nadia we were leaving. She did not argue. We put on shoes, grabbed our coats, and took Mabel downstairs. The hallway lights dimmed as we passed under them. In the kitchen, every cabinet door stood open. Nothing had fallen out. The doors were simply open at the same angle. Nadia stopped. I closed those. I know. We moved toward the garage. The tapping crossed the roof above us, keeping pace. When I opened the garage door, the overhead light failed to come on. My flashlight beam landed on the metal toolbox. The lid was open. I had locked it earlier. The prescription bottle stood upright on the floor beside it. The cap was missing. A thin trail of black particles crossed the concrete toward the interior wall. The line was only an inch wide. It continued up the wall and disappeared into the ceiling. I did not touch it. We got into Nadia's car because mine was parked outside under the dusty side of the roof. I used the remote to open the garage door. The door rose halfway, stopped, then lowered again. I tried a second time. It rose a few inches and stopped. The tapping above us ended. A heavy pressure settled over the garage. I felt it in my ears and jaw. Mabel crouched on the back seat and pressed herself against the door. The car radio turned on. There was no station, only static. Under the static, a slow clicking repeated. 3 clicks. A pause. 3 clicks. I started the engine and backed toward the closed garage door without thinking. Nadia shouted at me to stop. The garage door began to rise. It moved very slowly, shaking on its tracks. As soon as there was enough space, I drove under it. The antenna scraped the bottom panel. Outside, the rain had started again. I backed into the road and turned on the headlights. Something was standing on the roof. I saw it for less than 2 seconds. It was near the ridge above our bedroom, darker than the wet shingles. It looked low and broad, almost like a person crouching under a sheet, but there were no clear arms or head. Its surface seemed to absorb the porch light instead of reflecting it. Then the headlights swept away as I turned. Nadia twisted in her seat to look back. "What was that?" I said I did not know. We drove to Wes's house. He opened the door before we reached the porch. He said our call had woken him, though his phone showed no missed call. We stayed in his living room until daylight. Around 3 in the morning, a low humming sound passed over the neighborhood. It lasted less than a minute. The windows vibrated, and every dog on the road started barking at once. Wes stepped onto the porch, but the cloud cover was too thick to see anything. At sunrise, the weather cleared. The 3 of us walked back to our house. The black dust was gone. The shingles looked clean and dry, even though the rest of the roof was wet. There were no footprints, dents, or broken tiles. The attic hatch was closed. The circular marks in the dust were gone too. In the garage, the toolbox was locked. The prescription bottle was inside it with the cap screwed on. The sample remained at the bottom. I checked it under the microscope again. The particles no longer looked round. Each one had a shallow dent on one side. The dents were identical and shaped like narrow ovals. I called the roofing company Monday morning. A man named Curtis Bell inspected the entire roof. He found no leaks and no damage. He said the warm section could have been caused by poor insulation, though he could not explain the dust. Before he left, he pointed to a line of clean shingles above the bedroom. The line formed a rough oval about 12 feet long. Inside it, the roof granules had been pressed flat. Curtis asked whether I had put a tarp there. I said no. We replaced that section of roof the following spring. When the crew removed the shingles, they found black particles between the roofing felt and the plywood. The material formed a thin, even layer that ended at the same straight line I had seen in November. The plywood underneath was unmarked. I took another sample before they covered it. I kept it in a sealed glass jar in a storage unit across town. A few months later, I went to check the unit after a storm. The jar was still on the shelf where I had left it. The lid was closed. The black particles were gone. On the metal ceiling directly above the shelf, there were 3 small dents. They crossed the unit in a straight line toward the roll-up door. The first window looked clear, even though the storm had covered the whole mountain. I noticed it while I was carrying a stack of plates from the kitchen into the main room. Every window on the west side of the lodge showed the same thing: wet glass, dark pine trees, and low cloud pressing against the building. The window beside the old stone fireplace showed stars. I stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a few seconds. The glass was about 6 feet wide and divided into 4 panes. In it, I could see the room behind me. The dining table, the hanging lamps, and the staircase all reflected normally. Beyond those reflections was a clear black sky full of small white stars. Outside that same window, there should have been nothing but fog. My name was Colin Avery. I was 36 at the time, and I had rented the lodge with 5 friends for a long weekend in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. The place sat above Silverton at the end of a gravel road that was closed most of the winter. It was early May, but snow still covered the higher ground. The weather turned bad the afternoon we arrived. Heavy cloud moved in from the south, followed by cold rain and sleet. By dark, we could barely see the trees 20 yards from the porch. There were 6 of us: me, my girlfriend Hannah, my older brother Dean, Dean's wife Olivia, and our friends Marcus Lee and Tessa Vaughn. We had planned to hike during the day and drink around the fireplace at night. Instead, we spent most of the first evening inside, cooking too much food and listening to the storm hit the roof. At first, I thought the window was showing a reflection from a painting or television. There was no television in the main room, and the only picture on the opposite wall was a framed photograph of an elk. I walked closer. The stars seemed real. They were not fixed points on the glass. When I moved my head, the reflections of the furniture shifted, but the night sky stayed beyond them, as if I were looking through an open window. I called Hannah over. She stood beside me, holding a dish towel. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "You tell me." She looked at the other windows, then back at the clear one. "Maybe the cloud broke on that side." I turned off the nearest lamp. The stars became brighter. I put my face close to the glass. The pane was cold enough to fog from my breath. Outside, I could hear sleet ticking against it, but I could not see any drops or streaks on the reflected sky. Marcus came over and laughed when we explained it. "It's double pane glass," he said. "You're seeing something between the layers. Stars between the layers?" He pressed his hands around his face and looked through. His expression changed. "That's weird." Dean opened the front door. This wind pushed rain into the entryway. The porch lights showed thick fog moving across the clearing. He stepped outside, walked around the corner, and stood directly in front of the window. From inside, we could see the shape of his body through the wet glass. The stars remained behind his reflection. He waved. I waved back. When Dean came inside, he said the sky was completely covered. We moved from window to window. The kitchen windows showed fog. The glass doors to the deck showed fog. The upstairs bedroom windows showed only darkness and cloud. The fireplace window alone reflected a clear night. Tessa suggested it was an old mirror effect caused by the angle of the glass. Olivia thought there might be a hidden light outside. Marcus found a flashlight and shone it from different parts of the room. But nothing changed the sky. I took a picture with my phone. The photograph showed the room reflected in the glass, but the sky came out as a flat black area. No stars. I tried video. On the screen, the window looked normal and dark. When I lowered the phone, I could see the stars again. "That's enough for me," Olivia said. She pulled the curtain across the window. The lodge had thick red curtains mounted on a wooden rod. Once the glass was covered, we went back to dinner. For about 20 minutes, nobody mentioned it. Then we heard a light knock from behind the curtain. It was not loud. 3 soft taps against the glass. Dean looked at me. "Branch?" There were no branches close enough to touch that wall. The taps came again. 1. A pause. 2 more. Marcus walked over and pulled the curtain open. The clear sky was still there. A cluster of lights had appeared near the upper right corner. There were 5 of them, very small and close together. They formed an uneven shape like dots on one side of a die. They did not blink. I thought they were stars until they moved. The cluster shifted slowly toward the center of the window. We all watched without saying much. The movement was steady, not like aircraft lights crossing the sky. The dots stayed in the same pattern and grew slightly brighter as they moved. Hannah asked if anybody could see them outside. Dean opened the door again. This time, Marcus went with him. They stood on the porch and looked up. From inside, I watched through the glass doors. Their flashlight beams disappeared into the cloud after a few feet. The cluster continued moving in the reflection. Dean came back in and shook water off his jacket. "There's nothing out there," he said. "You can't even see the ridge." Marcus said he had heard a low sound outside, but Dean had not heard it. "What kind of sound?" I asked. "Like a truck idling far away." There were no other houses within several miles. The road ended at the lodge. Tessa closed the curtain again and moved a chair in front of it, which did not make much sense, but nobody objected. The storm got worse around 9. Wind hit the lodge in hard bursts. The lights flickered twice, and the satellite internet stopped working. We played cards at the dining table. Every few minutes, one of us looked toward the covered window. At 9:26, according to the clock above the kitchen doorway, something scraped slowly across the outside wall. The sound began near the fireplace and moved upward. It was too heavy to be a tree branch. It sounded like a shovel dragged over rough wood. Muddy water started dripping from the bottom edge of the curtain. Hannah noticed it first. A dark line had formed on the hardwood floor below the window. I touched it with a paper towel. The liquid was clear and cold. "That window must be leaking," Dean said. He opened the curtain. The glass was dry. No water ran down the inside or outside. The frame looked sealed. The cluster of lights had moved much closer. They were no longer small dots. Each one was about the size of a coin held at arm's length. The pattern had spread out, and I could see a faint dark area between them. It looked as if the lights were attached to something that blocked the stars. I stepped sideways. The shape stayed centered in the window. Hannah moved to the other side of the room. "It follows you," she said. She was right. No matter where we stood, the dark area remained directly beyond the reflected room, as though it were facing whoever looked at it. I turned my back on the window. Behind me, everybody went quiet. "What?" I asked. Olivia told me not to move. I looked over my shoulder. My reflection stood in the glass, but it was turned toward the window. I was facing away from it. The reflected version of me faced forward. For less than a second, I thought I had misunderstood the angle. Then the reflection lifted its head. I did not move. The reflected face was dark and unclear, but it wore my clothes and stood where I had been standing a moment earlier. The cluster of lights hovered above its shoulder. I stepped away. The reflection disappeared. Dean pulled the curtain shut so hard that one of the rings broke. We left the main room and went into the kitchen. Nobody made jokes after that. Marcus said the glass might be delayed somehow, like a video feed. Tessa asked what kind of window acted like a video feed. He did not answer. We decided to sleep upstairs and stay away from the room until morning. Before we went up, Dean checked every door and window. He also brought in the emergency radio from his truck. The weather station broadcast a winter storm warning. The announcer said visibility near the passes was close to 0. There were no reports of aircraft trouble or power outages. At 10:03, the radio went silent in the middle of a sentence. A steady tone replaced the broadcast. The tone was low enough that I felt it more than heard it. The hanging utensils above the stove began to move slightly. The tone stopped after 11 seconds. The radio announcer returned and finished the sentence as if nothing had happened. We went upstairs. The lodge had 4 bedrooms along a narrow hallway. Hannah and I took the room at the back, which faced east. Dean and Olivia were across from us. Marcus and Tessa shared the larger room near the stairs. We kept all the doors open. Around 11, the rain changed to wet snow. I could hear it brushing against the bedroom window. The glass showed only a faint reflection of the room and the porch light on the snow outside. There were no stars. Hannah sat on the bed with her boots still on. "You saw yourself turn around, right?" she asked. "I saw something in the glass. That wasn't what I asked." "Yes." She nodded and stared at the floor. A slow tapping started downstairs. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. It came from the direction of the fireplace window. Then the sound moved. Tap, pause, tap. It crossed the ceiling below us from the main room toward the staircase. Dean stepped into the hallway. "Everybody hearing that?" We were. The tapping reached the bottom of the stairs. The first stair creaked, then the second. Nothing was visible below. The upstairs lights dimmed. The sound continued upward, 1 step at a time. It did not sound like footsteps. There was only 1 point of contact, followed by a long pause. Tap, creak, tap, creak. Marcus appeared at his door holding a fireplace poker. Dean had a heavy flashlight. We watched the top of the stairs. The tapping stopped 2 steps below the landing. For almost a minute, there was no sound except wind. Then something tapped the wall beside my shoulder. I moved away so quickly that I hit the opposite door. A small dark spot had appeared on the paint. It looked wet. Another spot formed several feet farther along the hallway. Then another. Each mark appeared with a soft tap moving toward the back bedroom. Hannah pulled me inside and shut the door. The tapping continued along the hall. It reached our door. 3 slow taps landed near the top, higher than any of us could have reached without standing on something. I locked it. The bedroom window rattled. Outside, the snow moved sideways in the porch light. For a second, the cloud thinned. I saw one pale light high above the trees, then 4 others appeared around it. The same cluster. They were not in the reflection anymore. They were visible through the window. I called to Dean. Before he answered, the clouds closed and the lights vanished. The tapping moved from the bedroom door to the outside wall. It crossed behind the headboard, one knock every few seconds. Hannah and I stepped away from the wall. The sound reached the window. The glass bowed inward slightly. Not enough to break, just enough to change the reflection. The bedroom disappeared from it. The clear night sky returned. The cluster of lights filled most of the pane. There was a dark oval between them, just close enough now that I could not see its edges. The 5 lights sat on its surface without casting any glow around them. Something pale stood below the lights. At first, I thought it was my reflection. Then Hannah moved beside me, and the figure did not move. It was on the other side of the glass, though there was no balcony or roof outside that window. We were on the 2nd floor. The shape was narrow and roughly human in height. I could not see arms or clothing. Its head leaned slightly to one side. Hannah whispered that we needed to leave. The figure raised one hand. The motion was slow and uncertain, almost like it was copying something it had seen. I pulled the curtain closed. The cloth pushed inward as if air were pressing against it from outside. Dean tried the door. I unlocked it and let him in. We told him what we had seen. He went to the window and lifted one corner of the curtain. The glass showed snow and darkness. Nothing else. We all went downstairs together. The fireplace window curtain was open again. None of us had opened it. The reflected sky had no stars now. It showed the lodge from above. We could see the roof, the deck, and the vehicles parked beside the building. The angle looked as if the window were hanging a few hundred feet in the air and looking down. The 5 lights hovered over the lodge. One was directly above the chimney. The others formed a wide circle around the roof. Nothing was visible through the actual windows or when we opened the front door. Outside, the cloud was thick and the snow was falling hard. We stood on the porch for less than a minute. The air was completely silent. No wind, no trees moving, no snow hitting the roof. Snowflakes hung in front of us. They did not fall. Thousands of them remained fixed in the porch light, suspended at different heights. Marcus reached toward one. Before his fingers touched it, every flake dropped at once. The wind returned hard enough to push us back into the lodge. The clock above the kitchen door showed 11:42. My phone showed 12:19. Everyone else's phone showed a different time. Dean said 11:51. Hannah's said 12:07. Marcus's battery had died, even though it had been nearly full. The fireplace window showed the overhead view again. The lights had moved lower. Their glow spread across the roof, but we still saw nothing through the front windows. Then one of the vehicles disappeared from the reflection. It was Marcus's SUV. We looked through the glass door. The SUV was still parked outside. In the fireplace window, the empty space where it had been showed a dark patch in the snow. A few seconds later, Dean's truck disappeared too. Then my car. The reflection showed only the lodge surrounded by untouched snow. The dark oval above the chimney lowered until it covered the entire roof. The room lights went out. The fireplace continued burning, but its flames became low and blue. A pressure filled the room. My ears hurt, and breathing felt harder. Somewhere inside the walls, wood began cracking one piece at a time. A pale shape appeared in the window reflection behind us. It stood at the bottom of the staircase. I turned around. The staircase was empty. In the glass, the shape moved forward. It passed between our reflected bodies without disturbing them. I could not see a face. Where the face should have been, the image seemed smudged, like breath on glass. It stopped beside the dining table. The 5 lights above the lodge shifted. The pale figure looked upward. Every window in the room turned black. The pressure released. The fire returned to its normal color. Outside, wind and snow hit the building again. The clock showed 12:26. The fireplace glass no longer reflected the sky. It showed the room and nothing else. We did not sleep. At first light, the storm cleared enough for us to drive down the mountain. All 3 vehicles were where we had left them. A fresh layer of snow covered the roofs, except for one round patch on each vehicle where the metal was dry and warm. The gravel road was rough but passable. We reached Silverton a little after 8 and ate breakfast at a small cafe near the highway. Nobody talked much. We checked our phones after they connected to service. Each device showed the correct time. There were no missed calls, alerts, or unusual files. We drove home that afternoon. 2 weeks later, the lodge owner returned my security deposit and mentioned that he had replaced a cracked window in the main room. I asked which one. He said it was the large window beside the fireplace. A thin crack had formed on the outside pane in the shape of a circle. He sent me a picture. In the glass, behind the reflection of his camera, the sky was clear and dark. 5 small lights were visible above the roof. At the bottom of the window, 6 people stood inside the reflected room. The lodge owner had been there alone. The frost started about 20 feet past the old signal cabinet. At first, I thought somebody had sprayed fire extinguisher powder across the tunnel wall. It was white and uneven in the beam of my flashlight, and there should not have been anything frozen underground. It had been 98 degrees outside that afternoon, and the heat in the station mezzanine had been bad enough to make sweat run down my back before we even reached track level. Then I put my hand near it and felt the cold. My name was Andre Bell. I worked nights for the Transit Authority in Philadelphia, mostly checking power cables, drainage pumps, and signal equipment. This happened during a heat wave in July on a section of unused track between 2 active stations in North Philadelphia. There were 4 of us on the crew that night. Our supervisor was Melissa Grant. The other 2 were Vince Moreno and a newer guy named Tariq Dawson. We entered the tunnel a little after 1 in the morning during a planned service shutdown. The job was simple. A signal relay had been sending false occupancy readings, and we were supposed to inspect the wiring and replace anything damaged by water or rats. The tunnel was hot when we entered. Not warm. Hot. The rails gave off stored heat, and the air smelled like brake dust, old water, and metal. The frost made no sense. It covered the left wall, crossed the curved ceiling, and continued down the right wall, forming a complete arch over the tracks. The frozen section was about 12 feet wide. At both ends, it stopped in a perfectly straight line. 1 step outside it, the concrete was damp and warm. 1 step inside it, my breath showed. Vince laughed when he saw that. What, they put air conditioning down here? Nobody answered. Melissa walked forward and shone her light across the ceiling. Tiny ice crystals glittered above us. Thick frost covered the cable trays, bolts, pipes, and old tile work. Even the wooden ties had a pale coating on them. The rails were bare. That bothered me more than anything at first. The frost covered every surface except the 2 steel rails. They passed through the arch without any ice at all, black and wet-looking. Melissa touched the wall with the back of her glove. "This isn't residue," she said. Tariq checked the thermometer clipped to his bag. 91 here. He stepped under the arch. The reading dropped quickly. 80, 67, 51. It stopped at 34 degrees. We all watched the number. Melissa told him to back out. As soon as he crossed the straight edge of the frost, the temperature rose again. We checked for broken refrigeration lines, even though there were none in that tunnel. We checked water pipes, ventilation ducts, and the emergency exhaust system. Nothing nearby could have produced that kind of cold. I took a few pictures with my work phone. The first 2 came out blurred. The third showed the arch clearly, but the tunnel beyond it looked much longer than it should have. The tracks continued into darkness without the usual curve. I lowered the phone and looked with my own eyes. The tunnel curved left about 50 yards ahead, just like it was supposed to. On the screen, it went straight. I showed Vince. He wiped sweat from his forehead and looked from the phone to the tunnel. Camera glitch, he said. That was probably what it was, but he handed the phone back quickly. Melissa called control and reported the frost. The radio crackled. A dispatcher named Nolan answered, but his voice kept breaking up. That was normal underground. Melissa moved a few feet toward the arch to improve the signal. The moment she stepped beneath it, another voice came over all 4 radios. It was faint and low. I thought it was someone talking on a nearby channel. Melissa stopped. "Repeat that," she said. The voice continued. It sounded like a man speaking from far away, but I could not make out the words. There was a slow rhythm to it, 2 or 3 words followed by a long pause. Vince raised his radio closer to his ear. "Who's on this frequency?" The voice stopped. Melissa stepped out of the frozen area. Nolan came through clearly. "Maintenance 4, did you call?" Melissa looked at us. She stepped under the arch again. The faint voice returned immediately. This time I heard one word. "Wait." I looked at Tariq. "You heard that?" He nodded. Melissa backed out. The voice disappeared. We tested it twice more because that was the sort of thing we did when equipment acted strangely. We did not want to go back and report a ghost voice or some other nonsense. We wanted a repeatable fault. Every time one of us stood under the frost, the voice came through. Every time we stepped out, it stopped. The signal strength meter on the radios dropped to 0 while the voice was present. That should have meant we received nothing. Melissa told control we had interference and asked whether another crew was working nearby. Nolan said no. The nearest crew was almost 2 miles south. We tried changing channels. The voice came through on every one. On the emergency channel, it was clearer. "Stay clear." The words were quiet but understandable. Vince stared at his radio. Did it just say "stay clear"? Nobody had to answer. Melissa decided we would leave the section and wait for transit police and an electrical inspector. Before we went, she wanted the relay cabinet checked because the false signal might have been connected. The cabinet sat just beyond the frozen arch. We could have reached it by walking through 12 feet of cold tunnel. Melissa looked at me. "You and I go. 30 seconds. I did not want to, but I had been doing that job for 13 years. You followed the supervisor unless something was obviously unsafe, and frost alone did not count as an emergency under any rule I knew. We stepped beneath the arch. The cold went through my shirt immediately. My hard hat felt tight, and my teeth started aching. The voice returned. "Stay clear." Melissa kept moving. Our boots made soft, crunching sounds over the ties. Halfway through, the frost above us cracked. A thin line opened across the ceiling. Dark water appeared inside it, but it did not fall. It gathered in round drops that hung there, trembling. The radio voice spoke again. "Not that way." Melissa stopped. The tunnel lights behind us flickered. For a second, the warm section we had come from disappeared. There was no Vince, no Tariq, no equipment cart. The tracks continued straight behind us into darkness. Then the lights returned, and both men were standing where they had been. Vince shouted something, but his voice reached us late. I saw his mouth move first, then heard him call my name a second later. Melissa grabbed my arm. "We're going back." We turned around. The frozen section felt wider than before. I counted the ties as we walked. It should have taken 5 or 6 steps. After 10 steps, we were still beneath the arch. I looked at the frost line ahead. It stayed the same distance away. Melissa noticed too. She started walking faster. The voice on the radio changed. It was no longer saying words. It made a soft breathing sound, followed by a clicking noise every few seconds. Click. Breath. Click. Tariq stood at the edge of the frost, waving us toward him. He looked close enough to touch, but we were not reaching him. I turned around. The relay cabinet behind us was gone. In its place, the tunnel stretched straight into darkness. There was a light far down the track. It was pale and round, not like a train headlight. It held steady near the ceiling. "Don't look back," Melissa said. I faced forward. The cold had become painful. My fingers felt stiff inside my gloves, and frost had formed along the shoulders of Melissa's orange vest. The radios clicked together. Then the voice said my first name. "Andre." I stopped walking. Melissa pulled my arm. The voice repeated it. It did not sound threatening. It sounded tired. "Andre, wait." I had not said my name over the radio that night. Our call sign was Maintenance 4. I kept moving. A dark shape appeared on the left wall beside us. It looked like a shadow cast by a person standing just outside our flashlight beams. It moved along the frost at the same speed we did. There was nothing between us and the wall that could have made it. A second shadow formed on the right. Melissa's grip tightened on my sleeve. The two shapes leaned inward across the curved ceiling. The frost began making small popping sounds. Each pop left a round black spot in the ice. The spots opened one by one above us, forming a line toward the tunnel entrance. The voice said, "Follow." I did not trust it, but the black spots were the only thing changing. I stepped toward the next one. The frost line ahead moved closer. Melissa saw it too. We followed the spots, one tie at a time. The shadows moved beside us. The light far down the tunnel grew brighter, even though we were walking away from it. The radio began picking up other sounds. A train braking, a station announcement, people talking, then a child crying. The noises overlapped, all faint and distant, as if the radio were receiving years of sound at once. And underneath them, the voice kept reading one sentence: "Follow the empty track." I looked down. The rail on our right had disappeared. There was only one rail beneath the arch. I blinked and moved my flashlight. The second rail was there again. Then the left one vanished. The wooden ties continued across the ground, but the steel came and went depending on where I pointed the light. I stopped looking down. Ahead, Tariq and Vince appeared, stretched and narrow through the cold air. Vince reached toward us, but did not cross the frost line. "2 more steps," he shouted. His voice came through my radio before I heard it in the tunnel. Melissa took 1 step. The arch made a deep, cracking sound. The whole sheet of frost above us shifted slightly, not falling, but tightening against the concrete. I took the second step. Warm air hit my face. We crossed the line together and nearly fell into Vince. The frozen section behind us was 12 feet wide again. The relay cabinet sat beyond it where it had always been. The tunnel curved left ahead. My watch showed 1:19. Tariq said we had been under the arch for less than a minute. My phone showed 1:31. Melissa's showed 1:26. Vince's watch had stopped at 1:18. We moved back toward the station without waiting for anyone else. Control told us to remain in place, but Melissa said the tunnel was unsafe and ordered the crew out. Nobody argued. As we walked, the heat returned quickly. Sweat soaked through my shirt again, but my hands stayed numb. The voice followed us for about 100 yards. It came through the radios in broken pieces. "Wrong side." A pause. "Not open." Another pause. "4 coming." Then silence. We reached the maintenance platform near the station and met 2 transit police officers and an electrical supervisor named Howard Pike. Melissa explained the frost without mentioning the shadows or the tunnel changing. She only said there was severe cold, radio interference, and a possible visual distortion. Howard looked at us like we were overheated. Then he touched the frost on Melissa's vest. It had not melted. He scraped some into a sample bag. The material looked like ice, but it was dry. It did not leave water on the plastic. A larger team entered the tunnel around 2. We stayed at the station while they checked the section. After 20 minutes, Howard came back alone. "There's nothing down there," he said. Melissa asked about the frost. "Gone. The whole arch? The walls are warm." He showed us photographs. The tunnel looked normal. No frost, no wet concrete, no marks. The relay cabinet beyond the arch was open. We had not opened it. Inside, one wire had been removed from the false occupancy circuit and placed neatly on the cabinet floor. The exposed end was coated in the same white material found on Melissa's vest. The signal problem stopped after that. Transit management interviewed us separately the next morning. They blamed condensation, electrical interference, and heat stress. Our radios were sent for inspection. No faults were found. The audio recordings were mostly static. There was one clear section from the emergency channel. My voice said, "We're going back." Then a faint man's voice answered, "You already did." I had not heard that reply in the tunnel. The frost sample disappeared before it reached the lab. Howard said the evidence bag had been sealed inside a locked refrigerator. When the technician opened it, the bag was empty, and the inside of the refrigerator was coated in a perfect semicircle of ice. I stayed off tunnel duty for a week because 2 of my fingertips had mild frost damage. On my first night back, I worked at a different station across the city. Nothing unusual happened. I finished at 5, drove home, took a shower, and went to bed. Around 8 in the morning, I woke to my work radio clicking from the kitchen. I had switched it off and left it in my bag. The apartment was warm. Sunlight came through the blinds and traffic moved normally outside. The radio clicked again. A faint voice said, "4 coming." Then I heard a low rumble beneath the floor. A subway train passed underground several blocks away. The radio stayed silent after that. When I opened my work bag, a thin white line crossed the bottom from one side to the other. It formed a perfect arch around the radio. By the time Melissa arrived to look at it, the frost had melted. The bag was dry. The radio display showed an active channel that did not exist in our system. The number was .4. Melissa switched it off, removed the battery, and set it on my kitchen table. For the next 11 minutes, the speaker gave one slow click every time a train passed beneath the neighborhood. The first person I saw was the mother, and the burn across her face was so straight that I thought somebody had marked her with a ruler. It ran from one cheek to the other, crossing the bridge of her nose in a narrow red strip. The skin above and below it looked normal. There was no blistering, no swelling, just a band about an inch wide that looked exactly like a fresh sunburn. Her husband and teenage son had the same mark. My name was Dr. Simon Weller. At the time, I was the only full-time doctor working out of a small clinic near Hay-on-Wye, close to the Welsh border. The area was mostly farms, scattered houses, and villages where everybody knew who owned which field. I handled ordinary appointments during the day and shared emergency calls with another practice 20 miles away. The call came at 6:40 on a Sunday morning in August. The woman, Claire Pritchard, said something had happened to her family during the night. She sounded calm at first, but then she said all 3 of them had burns on their faces and none of them knew how they got them. I asked if there had been a fire, a heater fault, a chemical spill, anything like that. She said no. Their house sat at the end of a single-track lane outside Glasbury, about 15 minutes from my home. I arrived just after 7. The weather was warm and hazy, with low cloud over the hills and no direct sunlight. Claire met me at the door wearing a dressing gown. The red strip across her face was impossible to miss. Her husband, Gareth, was in the kitchen with their son, Owen. Gareth was 47 and worked with agricultural machinery. Owen was 15 and looked half asleep. All 3 marks were almost identical. I measured them. Claire's was 28 millimeters wide. Gareth's was 29. Owen's was 28. The bands crossed their faces at the same level, just below the eyes. The edges were sharp, not slightly sharp like a tan line, perfectly defined. On Gareth, the strip passed through stubble, but the hairs were not singed or discolored. I asked when they had noticed. Claire said she woke around 6 and felt heat in her cheeks. She looked in the mirror, then woke Gareth. They checked Owen because his room was across the hall. I asked whether they had slept in the same room. No. Claire and Gareth were in the front bedroom. Owen was in the back room. Their younger daughter, Mia, had slept downstairs because she had fallen asleep watching a film. She had no mark. I checked her too. Nothing unusual. None of them had pain beyond mild tenderness. Their eyes were normal. Pupils reacted properly. There was no headache, nausea, dizziness, confusion, or breathing problem. It looked like ultraviolet exposure, but the pattern made no sense. "Did you use a sun lamp?" I asked. Claire stared at me. "In our sleep? Anything with a bright bulb, a heater, insect lamp?" Gareth shook his head. I asked whether the bedroom curtains had been open. "They were closed," Claire said. "Both rooms?" "Yes." Gareth looked at her. "I closed ours." "And I closed Owen's when I checked on him," she said. She had gone into Owen's room around 11 to collect glass from his desk. He was already asleep. The curtains were shut. I examined the bedrooms. The front room faced east over a sheep field. Thus, thick curtains covered the 2 windows. They overlapped in the center and reached almost to the floor. The back room faced a wooded slope and had a roller blind as well as curtains. The beds were in different positions. Claire and Gareth had slept with their heads against the north wall. Owen's bed ran beneath his window with his head toward the west. A horizontal beam entering both rooms could not have crossed all 3 faces at the same angle unless they had been sitting upright. I asked how they normally slept. Gareth slept on his side. Claire usually faced away from him. Owen said he he slept on his stomach. That did not help. I took photographs for their medical records and told them to use cool compresses and a simple moisturizer. I also advised blood tests at the clinic the next morning, mostly because I did not know what else to do. Before leaving, I checked the boiler, carbon monoxide alarm, and electrical heaters. Nothing showed a fault. As I stepped outside, their neighbor called to me from the lane. Her name was Enid Morgan. She was in her 70s and lived in a stone cottage about 200 yards away. She had been watching from her garden and asked whether the family was all right. I said they were stable. She glanced toward the upstairs windows. I thought something was wrong last night. I stopped. What did you see? She hesitated, then said she had been awake around 2 because her dog was barking. When she looked out, she saw a pale line moving across the front of the Pritchards' house. What kind of line? Light, she said, like someone shining through a narrow gap. She held her hands apart by about a foot. It went across the upstairs windows very slowly, from left to right. I asked if it could have been headlights from the lane. No car came up? Farm equipment? At 2 in the morning? She said the light had no visible source. It formed a narrow horizontal band across the stone wall and windows. It moved steadily for perhaps a minute, disappeared around the side of the house, then showed briefly through the back bedroom window. Did you see it inside the rooms? Through the curtains, she said. The curtains lit up. I asked what color it was. Fur, not white, more like old moonlight. Her dog had stopped barking the moment the light disappeared. I went back inside and told Claire what Enid had reported. Gareth looked annoyed. She watches this place constantly. Claire did not respond. She was staring toward the hallway. What? I asked. She said she remembered hearing something during the night, not waking exactly. More like hearing it inside a dream. A tapping sound, she said, on the glass. Gareth said he had heard nothing. Owen looked up from his phone. I heard that. His parents turned toward him. He said he remembered 3 taps at his window. He thought it was a branch, though there were no branches near the back of the house. What time? I asked. He did not know. Did you get up? No. Did you open your eyes? I don't think so. He touched the red band on his nose. I remember the room being bright. Gareth told him he had probably seen the morning light from. The blind was down, Owen said. Nobody spoke for a moment. I left instructions for them to call if they developed eye pain, blistering, fever, or confusion. Then I drove home. At the clinic the next morning, the burns looked darker but remained narrow and sharply defined. Blood tests were normal. Liver and kidney function were normal. No unusual inflammatory markers. Eye examinations showed no damage. I used a handheld ultraviolet lamp over the skin. The burned areas fluoresced faintly blue. That sometimes happened with certain creams or chemicals, but none of them had used the same products. I swabbed the skin and sent samples to a lab. The report later showed traces of sodium, calcium, and an unidentified metallic residue in amounts too small to analyze properly. By Wednesday, the redness had started fading. That should have been the end of it. Then Enid called me directly. She said the light had returned. Bonsoir. This was just after midnight on Thursday. I was not on call, but she sounded frightened enough that I got dressed and drove out. The sky was clear that night. The moon was low behind the hills, and the fields were covered in thin mist. When I reached the lane, Enid was standing outside in a coat over her nightdress. The Pritchards' house was dark. What happened? I asked. She pointed toward the upper floor. I saw it again. It started on the far wall. She said the band of light had moved across the house exactly as before, but this time it stopped at Owen's window. How long? Maybe 5 minutes. I called Claire. She answered after several rings and came downstairs to let us in. She had been asleep. Gareth and the children were still in bed. We checked their faces. No new burns. Owen's room smelled faintly of hot dust, like an electric heater warming after months of disuse. The heater was off and unplugged. Bessing, I touched the window glass. It was cold except for a narrow horizontal strip across the center. That section was warm. The warmth ran through both panes of the double-glazed window. I measured it with an infrared thermometer from my medical bag. The room was 18 degrees Celsius. Most of the glass was 16. The narrow strip measured 38. It extended from one side of the window to the other and matched the height of Owen's bed. Claire woke Gareth. He became angry when he saw Enid in the house. He said she was encouraging everyone to panic. Then he touched the glass and stopped talking. A quiet clicking sound came from outside. 3 clicks. A pause. 3 more. We all heard it. It seemed to come from the field behind the house. Gareth opened the window. Cold air entered the room. The field was empty. Mist lay close to the ground, and the tree line was visible against the sky. No lights, no people, no vehicle. And then a pale band appeared across the grass. It was about a meter wide and perfectly straight. It moved from the trees toward the house. The light did not shine down from above. It seemed to exist on the surface of the field, turning the grass gray as it passed. Gareth leaned out farther. "What is that?" The band moved without changing speed. When it reached the garden fence, the metal wires made a soft humming sound. Claire pulled Owen away from the window. I expected the light to reach the wall, but it stopped several feet from the house. The mist above it began to rise. A long, dark shape became visible behind the pale band, not on the ground, but above it. I could not judge the distance. It looked flat and oval, with an edge that blurred into the sky. There were no lights attached to it. The stars disappeared where the shape passed. I stepped back from the window. The clicking came again, this time from the roof. The band on the grass faded. The dark shape remained for another few seconds, then became impossible to separate from the night. Gareth closed the window and locked it. Nobody suggested headlights after that. We moved downstairs. Mia was awake on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket. She said she had heard footsteps in the hall, though everyone except Claire had been upstairs. I checked the house room by room with Gareth. Nothing was disturbed. At the end of the upstairs corridor, I noticed a narrow red line on the wallpaper. It crossed the wall at face height. I touched it. The paper was warm. The line continued into Claire and Gareth's bedroom, passed across the headboard, and ended at the outer wall. In Owen's room, a similar line crossed the blind and bed. It was not a stain. Under normal light, it was barely visible, but through my phone camera, it appeared bright white. I took several pictures. In every photograph, the line extended beyond the wall, continuing through empty space outside the house. At 1:36, all 4 phones in the room lost signal. The digital clock in the kitchen changed to 2:14. It stayed there. My wristwatch stopped at 1:36. The clicking moved across the ceiling. Slowly. 1 tap above the kitchen, a pause, another above the hallway. Mia started crying quietly. Claire held her close. Gareth picked up a heavy torch and went toward the back door. I told him not to go outside. He stopped with his hand on the lock. A pale line appeared beneath the door. It was thin at first, then widened to about an inch. It moved upward over the wood. The paint did not brighten. The light passed through it, showing as a clean band across the inside surface. It crossed Gareth's legs. He jumped back. A red strip appeared through the fabric of his trousers, visible for a second like light through skin. Then the band continued up the door and disappeared into the ceiling. The tapping stopped directly above us. The whole house became quiet. Not ordinary nighttime quiet. The refrigerator stopped humming, the boiler went silent. Even the clock's second hand stopped. A pressure built in my ears. Owen said, "It's looking." His voice was flat and distant. Claire gripped his shoulder. "What did you say?" He looked confused. "I don't know." A soft pale glow spread across the ceiling. It formed a narrow rectangle about 6 feet long. Inside it, the plaster seemed transparent. I could see darkness above the house, not the attic, open darkness. Several small points of light moved slowly across it in a tight group. They were too close together to be stars. The group stopped over the center of the room. Every one of us looked up. The pressure in my ears became painful. Then the lights shifted apart. Something narrow passed between them, blocking them one after another. Mia buried her face in Claire's side. The ceiling returned to normal. The refrigerator started again. My watch jumped from 1:36 to 1:47. The kitchen clock changed from 2:14 to 1:47. 11 minutes had passed. A sharp smell filled the room, similar to rain on hot pavement. We checked everyone again. No new burns. Then Claire turned toward me. A fresh red band crossed the back of her neck. Gareth had one too. Owen lifted his hair. The same narrow burn ran across the base of his skull. The marks were exactly level, as if the light had passed through them from front to back. Mia had no burn. Neither did Enid. I checked myself in the hall mirror. A red strip crossed my face beneath my eyes. The skin felt warm. I drove home just before dawn after arranging for the family to stay with Claire's sister in Brecon. Enid went with them. Gareth refused at first, then agreed when the tapping started again in the upstairs wall. My own burn faded over the next 5 days. The laboratory found the same faint metallic residue on my skin. The Pritchards sold the house the following spring. Gareth told me the new owners replaced all the upstairs windows before moving in. Several months later, I passed the property while returning from a farm call. It was nearly noon, bright and clear. A workman was standing on a ladder beside Owen's old bedroom window. He had removed the outer frame and was staring at something inside the wall. I stopped and asked if he needed help. He showed me a narrow strip of stone running horizontally through the house. The stone was pale, smooth, and warm to the touch. It passed through the mortar without any joint or break. The workmen said they had followed it from one side of the house to the other. It crossed both bedrooms at the exact height of the burns. As we stood there, 3 soft taps came from inside the wall. The workmen stepped away. A pale band moved beneath the surface of the stone, traveling slowly toward the back of the house. The flowers closed just after noon, all at the same time. I was kneeling beside the south bed, pulling crabgrass from between the edging stones when I noticed the change. A row of orange gazanias had been open a moment earlier. Their petals were spread flat in the sun. Then the whole row folded inward, starting at one end and moving to the other. It took maybe 3 seconds. The weather was clear and hot. There was not a cloud anywhere near the garden. And the bed had full sun from late morning until evening. Gazanias sometimes closed in shade or bad weather, so I looked up, expecting a cloud to be crossing the sun. The sky was empty. My name was Rachel Dwyer. I was 44 at the time, and I worked as the groundskeeper for a small historic property outside Williamsburg, Virginia. The main house dated back to the 1790s, but most of the gardens had been rebuilt in the 1980s. It was not a grand tourist place. We hosted weddings, school visits, and a few seasonal events. Most weekdays I worked alone. The south bed ran along a low brick wall behind the greenhouse. It was about 30 feet long and 6 feet wide. That summer I had planted gazanias, zinnias, marigolds, salvia, and a border of white alyssum. Only the gazanias closed. I checked my phone. It was 12:03. I touched one of the flowers. The petals felt normal. The stem was firm, and the leaves showed no sign of wilting. The soil was damp from watering that morning. A shadow moved over the bed. It came from behind me and traveled slowly across the flowers toward the brick wall. I looked up again. Nothing passed overhead. There were no birds, planes, insects, branches, or clouds. The nearest tree was a large pecan about 40 feet away, and its shadow fell in the opposite direction. The moving shade was soft around the edges, not dark like the shadow of a solid object. It was more like a thin cloud passing in front of the sun, except the light on my arms did not change. Only the flower bed dimmed. The shadow crossed the gazanias and stopped against the wall. For several seconds it held there. Then it moved back the way it had come. When it left the bed, the flowers opened. They did not turn toward the sun. Every flower head faced straight upward. That was not how they had been planted or how they normally grew. The stems leaned at different angles, but each head had twisted so the center pointed directly at the sky. I stood and walked along the row. There were 36 plants. I knew because I had ordered 3 trays of 12. All 36 faced up. I took a few photos with my phone. In the pictures, the flowers looked normal. They appeared angled toward the southwest, where the sun was. I lowered the phone. They were still pointing vertically. I took another picture and compared it while standing beside the bed. On the screen, the shadows of the petals fell toward the wall. In front of me, the shadows fell toward my shoes. I thought the heat might be affecting me. I went inside the greenhouse, drank water, and sat near the fan for 10 minutes. When I came back out, the flowers had returned to their usual positions. I decided I had misread what I saw. Around 1, the property manager, Linda Chavez, arrived to meet a caterer for an upcoming wedding. I mentioned the flowers closing, but I made it sound like a gardening issue. Maybe they're getting too much water, she said. They only closed for a minute. Could be heat stress. I accepted that because it was easier than explaining the shadow. The next day it happened again. At 11:58, the flowers were open. At 12:01, they closed in sequence. This time, I was standing beside the bed with my phone recording. The camera showed the flowers remaining open. I watched the screen and the actual bed at the same time. On the screen, orange petals moved slightly in the breeze. Beyond the phone, every flower was closed. The soft shadow entered from the grass, crossed my boots, and moved into the bed. I felt no change in temperature. A honeybee flying between the plants passed through the shadow. For a moment, I could not see it. The bee did not become dark or blurred, it simply disappeared while inside the shaded area. I heard its buzzing continue. It came out the other side and flew away. I stepped back. The shadow moved along the bed and paused near the center. The closed flowers began turning. Their stems rotated slowly, making faint, dry sounds against the mulch. Each flower shifted until its folded head pointed straight up. The motion was small but clear. I bent down and placed 2 fingers lightly around one stem. It turned inside my grip. There was more force behind it than I expected. Not enough to hurt me, but enough that I let go. The shadow slid toward the wall. The flowers opened together. For a few seconds, their dark centers seemed deeper than normal. I could not see the yellow rings around them, even though I was close. Then the colors returned. My phone recording showed nothing unusual. The entire video was 1 minute and 40 seconds of open flowers moving in sunlight. The timestamp jumped from 12 to 12:04 halfway through. I had not recorded for 4 minutes. I checked the greenhouse clock. It read 12:04. My watch said 12:01. I spent the afternoon checking irrigation lines and soil conditions. Nothing was wrong. I dug up one plant near the end of the row and examined the roots. They were healthy. Under the plant, about 8 inches down, I found a patch of gray soil. It formed a smooth circle about the width of a dinner plate. The soil above and around it was dark brown clay. The gray material was dry and powdery. I pushed the trowel into it. The metal came out cold. It was 94 degrees outside. I called Linda and told her there might be contamination in the bed. She arranged for a soil testing company to take samples. The technician came 2 days later. His name was Evan Price. He collected soil from 6 points, including the gray patch. While he worked, I asked if he had ever seen soil that stayed cold underground. Pipes, maybe, he said. There were no pipes under that part of the garden. I had the utility map. At noon, the flowers kneeling beside them, he looked at the row, then at me. Is that normal? No. No. The shadow moved across the grass. Evan noticed it immediately. He stood and looked at the sky, like, what's blocking the sun? Nothing. The shadow reached his legs. He jumped backward. Did you feel that? I had never felt anything when it touched me. He rubbed the front of his jeans. It felt like static. The shadow crossed the bed. The flowers rotated upward. Evan pulled out his phone. On his screen, the bed looked bright and the flowers remained open. He lowered it slowly. They were closed. He did that 3 times. Then he put the phone in his pocket. I'm taking the samples now, he said. He packed the containers faster than before. The shadow stopped near the gray patch. Something clicked below the soil. It sounded like 2 stones tapping together. The sound repeated at even intervals. Click. 5 seconds. Click. Evan crouched but did not touch the ground. Could be an irrigation valve. There isn't one there. The shadow moved away. The flowers opened facing upward. Evan left without filling out the paperwork. He called me the following afternoon. 5 of the soil samples were normal. The gray material was mostly silica and aluminum with traces of iron and magnesium. Nothing toxic. What was strange about it? I asked. He went quiet. The particles were too uniform. How uniform? Same size, same shape, almost all of them. He said the grains were smooth ovals under magnification, each one about 1/4 of a millimeter long. I asked, what could cause that? Manufacturing, maybe. Who manufactures soil? He gave a short laugh, but did not answer. He said the sample container had been cold when it reached the lab, even though it spent 2 hours in a hot truck. The next morning, the gray patch had doubled in size. I had marked the edge with wooden stakes. The circle now extended several inches beyond them in every direction. The gazania above it had changed. Its stem was straight and almost twice as tall as the others. The flower faced directly upward even before noon. I cut it off and put it in a bucket inside the greenhouse. Clear liquid came from the cut stem. It had no smell and was thicker than water. The severed flower stayed open. At 12:02, the flowers in the bed closed. The one in the bucket closed too. The greenhouse roof was glass and sunlight filled the room. No shadow crossed the floor. Still, something moved over the flower. It appeared as a faint oval dimness around the bucket, maybe 3 feet wide. The light outside the oval stayed the same. The flower turned upward, even though the stem lay sideways against the rim. The head twisted until it faced the glass ceiling. Above it, I saw a pale spot in the sky. It was not a light exactly. It looked like a section of blue sky that had lost its color. The spot was round and hard to focus on. Whenever I looked directly at it, it seemed to shift a little to one side. I stepped outside. The pale spot remained over the greenhouse. There was no sound from it. A passenger plane crossed far to the east. Its engine noise reached me normally. The pale spot did not move. I called Linda and asked her to come to the property. She arrived around 12:30 after the flowers had reopened. By then, the spot was gone. I showed her the gray soil and the tall cut stem. She told me to remove the entire bed. We scheduled 2 landscaping workers for Friday morning. That Thursday, I stayed late because of a wedding rehearsal. The guests left around 7. Linda locked the main house and drove away, leaving me to shut the greenhouse and tool shed. The evening was hot and still. The gazanias remained open as the sun dropped toward the trees. Normally, they began closing before dusk. At 8:14, they turned upward. One after another, all 36 heads shifted until they faced the darkening sky. I stood by the greenhouse door and watched. The soft shadow appeared on the bed. There was almost no direct sunlight left, so it should have been impossible to see a shadow. Still, the oval dimness moved over the flowers and stopped. The air above the bed began to ripple. It looked like heat rising from pavement, but the temperature dropped around me. My arms broke out in goosebumps. A low humming sound came from somewhere overhead. The porch lights on the main house flickered. The flowers opened wider than I had ever seen them. Their petals bent back until the dark centers were fully exposed. The centers reflected small points of white light, not all in the same place. Each flower showed a slightly different pattern. I leaned closer. The points moved. They formed a cluster of 5 or 6 lights traveling across the dark centers from one edge to the other. I heard the clicking beneath the soil again. This time, several points clicked at once. The sound spread under the whole bed. I backed toward the tool shed. The ground inside the brick border lifted slightly. It did not split. The mulch and plants rose together by an inch or two, as if pressure had built beneath them. Then it settled. The flowers stayed pointed upward. I called Linda, but the call failed before it connected. My phone showed full signal. A message appeared on the screen saying the number was not available. Underneath it, the time read 12:02. It was after 8 in the evening. The greenhouse lights came on by themselves. Inside, the cut flower in the bucket had opened again. Its center faced the roof. The low hum grew stronger. I looked up. A dark shape was visible above the garden. It was hard to judge its height. It could have been 100 feet up or just above the trees. It was a broad oval, slightly darker than the evening sky, with no sharp edge. No lights were attached to it. The stars had started appearing in the east. Through the dark oval, I could not see any. It held still over the south bed. The soft shadow below matched its shape. I walked backward toward my truck. The flowers turned as I moved. Their stems bent toward me, but the heads remained aimed at the object overhead. The effect made them seem to follow both of us at once. The clicking under the soil stopped. A single tap came from the greenhouse roof, then another. The taps moved across the glass panels from south to north. Nothing touched the roof. I reached my truck and opened the door. The engine would not start. The dash lights came on, but the starter made no sound. The hum pressed against the windows. Loose receipts on the passenger seat lifted and trembled. I tried the key again. Nothing. The dark shape shifted toward the parking area. It did not travel through the sky in a normal way. The oval faded in one place and became darker in another, closer to me. The shadow crossed the lawn. Every flower in the south bed closed. The greenhouse went dark. For a few seconds, I heard no insects, road noise, or wind. Even the hum stopped. Then a voice came from the truck radio. The radio was off. It was very faint and broken, like speech coming through several walls. I could not understand the first part. Then it said, "Keep facing up." The dashboard clock changed to 12:03. I turned the key. The engine started. I backed out hard enough to throw gravel against the tool shed. The headlights swept across the south bed. The flowers were gone. The soil was flat and dark inside the brick border. No stems, petals, leaves, or holes remained. It looked as if nothing had ever been planted there. The dark oval was no longer visible above the garden. I drove to the main road and stopped beneath the lights of a gas station about 5 miles away. My phone showed 9:01. The drive should have taken 10 minutes. I had left the property at about 8:20. Linda answered when I called. She said she had been trying to reach me for half an hour because the security alarm at the greenhouse kept activating and clearing. I told her I was going home and would meet her there in the morning. I slept badly and returned after sunrise. Linda and the 2 landscaping workers were already standing near the south bed. The flowers were back. All 36 plants stood in their original positions. None looked disturbed. The one I had cut was growing again, as tall as before, with no mark on the stem. The gray soil was gone. The workers dug down almost 2 feet across the bed. They found normal clay and a few old roots. Linda canceled the removal. She said we would close that part of the garden to visitors and replace the flowers after the wedding season. At noon, we stood 20 feet away and watched. The gazanias closed in sequence. The soft shadow crossed the bed. Nothing passed over the sun. When the flowers opened, every head faced straight upward. The tall one near the center opened last. Inside its dark center, one small white point appeared. Then a second, then 3 more holding close together while the shadow moved slowly across the grass toward us. The first mark had moved about 6 feet to the left. I noticed it when I pulled onto the bypass just after sunrise. We had painted the survey line the evening before, and I expected to see a straight row of orange crosses running down the middle of the unfinished road. Instead, the first cross sat near the shoulder. I stopped the truck and got out. The paint was dry, the edges were sharp, there were no drag marks, tire tracks, or smears connecting it to the spot where we had put it. My name was Nathan Cole. I was 39 at the time, and I worked for a civil engineering company based in Shrewsbury. We were surveying a new bypass outside a small town near the Welsh border. The road had been graded but not paved. It was mostly compacted stone, drainage trenches, and piles of soil. There were 4 of us on the crew. My supervisor was Helen Ward. The others were Lewis Morgan and a younger technician named Priya Shah. The previous afternoon, we had marked the center line for a final drainage check. We used bright orange temporary paint and set the marks at 10-meter intervals. Helen worked from the total station while Priya held the prism. Lewis and I followed behind with the paint. The line was straight for almost half a mile. We finished around 7. It had been warm and dry, with almost no wind. Before leaving, Helen photographed the completed line from both ends. There was no question where the marks had been. That morning, every one of them had shifted. Not by the same amount. The first few sat 6 feet left of the original line. Farther down, the distance increased. Near the middle of the site, the marks curved around an empty patch of ground, then returned gradually to the correct center line. The curve was smooth. It looked deliberate. I walked along the road, checking each mark. All of them were intact. The paint had soaked into the stone exactly as it normally did. There was no sign that anyone had covered the original marks or repainted them. I called Helen. She arrived 20 minutes later with Priya. Lewis came shortly after that. Helen stood near the first cross with her tablet and compared it to the previous evening's photographs. "That was over there," she said. She pointed toward the middle of the road. "I know." Priya crouched and touched the paint. "It isn't fresh. No. Could someone have copied the marks? With the same stencil?" Lewis asked. We did not use a stencil. Each cross had been painted freehand, and mine had a slight hook on one side because the nozzle was partly blocked. The shifted marks had the same imperfections. I found one I remembered clearly. I had sneezed while spraying it and left a small orange dot about a foot away. The cross had moved. The dot had moved with it. Helen told us not to touch anything else until she checked the survey coordinates. She set up the total station on the same control point we had used the day before. The point was a steel pin driven into concrete beside the road. It had not moved. Priya walked to the first painted mark with the prism. The coordinates were wrong by just over 2 meters. At the middle of the bend, they were wrong by almost 9. At the far end, they returned to within a few centimeters of the original design. Helen checked the instrument 3 times. The machine was fine. We searched the area for footprints. The ground on either side of the road was soft from rain earlier that week. There were fox tracks, bird marks, and our own boot prints from the previous day. Nothing followed the shifted line. The empty patch in the center of the curve looked ordinary. It was roughly oval, maybe 40 meters long and 20 wide. No trees, rocks, pipes, or equipment occupied it. The surface had been graded flat with the rest of the road. Lewis walked into the middle of it. His radio clicked. We all heard it. 3 soft bursts of static. He stopped. "What was that?" Helen asked him to repeat himself. I didn't say anything. The radio clicked again. This time mine did too. Lewis took another step. All 4 radios gave a low hum. It lasted 2 seconds and stopped when he backed away. Priya looked at the ground. There could be a cable under here. Helen checked the site plan. The nearest buried service was nearly 100 meters east. I walked toward Lewis. When I crossed the curved line of orange marks, pressure built in my ears. It felt like entering a tunnel in a fast train. The air inside the empty patch was cooler, not dramatically cold, maybe 5 or 6 degrees lower than the rest of the site. The morning sun had already warmed the gravel outside it, but the ground inside felt damp and cool through my boots. I called out to Helen. My voice sounded normal to me, but she frowned. "What?" I said, "It's colder here." She said she had only heard the last word. I repeated it. My radio transmitted a second version of my voice half a second later. "Colder here." The repeated words sounded flat and distant. I switched the radio off. The speaker still gave one soft click. I moved back across the painted curve. The pressure in my ears stopped immediately. Helen decided we had a vandalism problem until proven otherwise. She called the site manager and requested a drone survey so we could document the shifted marks from above. The drone operator arrived around 10. His name was Gavin Reese, and he had photographed the bypass several times during construction. He launched from the southern end and flew a standard grid over the road. The live video showed the orange line clearly. From the air, the curve looked more pronounced. It bent around the empty area in a clean arc, leaving a wide gap between the paint and the center of the patch. Gavin zoomed in. "Was something stored there?" he asked. "No," Helen said. "There's a different color in the ground." I could not see it from where we stood, but on the screen the oval area looked slightly darker than the surrounding stone. Gavin lowered the drone. At about 60 feet, the video began flickering. Thin horizontal lines crossed the image. The camera tilted even though the drone itself remained level. Then the screen froze. The last frame showed the empty patch from directly above. In the center was a faint dark circle. Gavin tried to move the drone away. The controls did nothing. The altitude reading changed from 62 feet to 0, then to 312. We could still see the drone above us. It hovered in place without drifting. There was almost no wind, but even in calm weather, a drone made constant small corrections. This one looked fixed to the sky. The propellers continued turning. The sound changed. Instead of the usual high buzz, it became a lower pulsing noise. Priya pointed upward. A soft shadow had appeared under the drone. That should have been normal, except the sun was behind us and the shadow fell in the wrong direction. The dark patch moved across the road toward the empty oval. The drone did not move with it. When the shadow reached the center, all 4 radios turned on. Mine was still switched off. A voice came through. It was very faint. At first, I thought it said clear. Then it repeated, "Keep clear." Gavin killed the motors. The propellers kept spinning. He pressed the emergency stop several times. Nothing changed. The drone began moving sideways, not flying. It remained level and simply slid over the road until it reached the edge of the curved paint line. There it stopped. The propellers slowed. Control returned. Gavin landed it immediately. The battery was warm but not damaged. The recording had a gap of 11 minutes, though the whole incident had lasted less than 2 by my watch. Helen's watch showed 10 minutes had passed. Mine showed 3. Priya's phone had stopped at 10:17. The site manager, Paul Hargreaves, arrived shortly before lunch. He was already angry because the project was behind schedule. He listened to Helen's explanation, looked at the curved marks, and said somebody had repainted the line as a prank. Helen showed him the previous day's photographs. Paul said the crew must have made the mistake originally. "We checked it with the instrument," she said. "Then check it again." We did. He walked into the empty patch. The radios hummed. Paul ignored them. Near the center, he stopped and looked down. "What's this?" A narrow depression had appeared in the gravel. It was not there earlier. The line was about an inch wide and perfectly smooth, as if a cable had been pressed into the surface and then removed. It ran across the oval from north to south. Paul followed it. The farther he went, the quieter his boots became. I could see him stepping on loose stone, but after a few yards, I could not hear the crunch. He turned toward us and said something. No sound reached us. Helen raised her radio. Paul's voice came through backward. The words were not clear, but the rhythm was unmistakably reversed. He looked down at his radio, confused. Then the low pulsing sound returned. It did not come from the drone this time. It came from beneath the road. Loose stones trembled around our boots. Dust lifted in small circles. Paul walked quickly toward us. The distance between him and the painted curve did not seem to change. He took 5 steps, then 10. He remained near the center of the oval. His expression shifted from irritation to fear. Helen shouted for him to stop. He could not hear her. The air above the patch began to ripple. It looked like heat haze, but the temperature had dropped. My breath showed faintly. A pale shape appeared high above the site. It was difficult to focus on. At first, I thought it was a patch of thin cloud, though the sky was clear. It had a broad oval outline and seemed brighter than the blue around it without giving off light. The pulsing under the road matched the pressure in my ears. Paul tried running. He moved in place for several seconds. Then the radio voice returned. "Outside line." Helen looked at the curved marks. "Nathan, the paint." I understood. We moved along the road until we stood where the orange line came closest to Paul. He was about 20 feet inside the curve. I stepped across it. The cold hit me immediately. The road behind Paul stretched much farther than it should have. The machinery at the northern end looked tiny and distant, though it was less than half a mile away. I kept my eyes on the orange marks. 1 step inside the curve, the pressure increased. 2 steps, and every sound faded. I could see Helen shouting behind me, but I heard nothing. Paul reached toward me. He looked close, yet I could not judge the distance. The radio clipped to my vest clicked. "Not center." The voice sounded like Helen, but she had not transmitted. I moved sideways instead of straight toward Paul, following the painted curve. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt toward the oval's center. Loose stones rolled uphill, passing my boots and disappearing into a patch of dark gravel. The pale shape above us became clearer. It was not a cloud. It looked like a blank section cut out of the sky, oval and flat, with a narrow gray edge. I could see no surface details. A cluster of small lights sat along one side, so dim they were only visible when I looked away from them. I kept moving along the paint. Paul began moving too. He copied my direction, walking sideways instead of toward me. The distance between us shortened. The pulsing stopped. For a moment, complete silence covered the site. Then the ground inside the oval dropped. Not physically. The gravel did not collapse. It looked as if the surface had fallen several feet while remaining in place, creating a deep, flat depression that my eyes could not make sense of. Something dark stood at the bottom. It was narrow and upright, but I could not see clear arms, legs, or a face. It seemed more like an absence in the view than a solid figure. Paul saw it. He stopped moving. The shape leaned slightly toward him. His radio spoke in his own voice. "Wrong way." I shouted at him to keep moving, though I could not hear myself. He looked at the orange paint, stepped sideways again, and reached the curve. The instant he crossed it, sound returned. He fell onto his hands and knees beside me. The road inside the oval looked flat again. The dark figure was gone. The pale shape in the sky faded until only blue remained. All 4 radios went silent. Paul crawled several feet before standing. His face had lost color, and he did not argue when Helen told everyone to leave the site. We drove back to the temporary office near the southern roundabout. According to the vehicle clocks, it was 12:46. Gavin's phone showed 108. The site camera at the entrance had recorded us entering the bypass that morning. At 10:17, the image froze. It resumed at 12:45. During the missing period, no vehicles entered or left. We had all remembered working through those 2.5 hours, but when we added up the events, it felt like less than one. The project was shut down for the rest of the day. A geotechnical team came the following morning. They drilled test holes in the empty patch and found normal compacted fill over natural clay. Ground radar showed no pipes, cavities, metal, or buried structures. The temperature was the same as the surrounding road. The orange marks were still curved. Paul ordered them removed. Lewis used black cover paint over each cross. We watched him work from one end to the other. Then we repainted the original straight line according to the survey coordinates. Before leaving, Helen photographed every new mark. The next morning, the straight line had moved again. The black cover paint remained where Lewis had sprayed it. The new orange crosses sat several feet to one side, forming the same curve around the oval. This time, there were two lines, the covered original curve and the fresh one beside it. An aerial survey was done from a helicopter instead of a drone. The photographs showed both curved lines clearly. They also showed something none of us had seen from the ground. The gravel inside the empty patch contained a long, dark shape. It looked like a shadow cast from directly above, though there had no clouds during the flight. The outline was oval, about 30 meters across, and slightly pointed at one end. At the center stood 4 small, pale marks. They were arranged in a straight line. When the photograph was enlarged, the marks looked like people wearing high-visibility clothing. There had been nobody standing inside the patch when the helicopter passed. The bypass design was changed. Officially, the engineers found unstable drainage conditions and moved the road 9 meters west. The revised route followed the shifted paint almost exactly. Construction continued without any more major incidents. I stayed with the project until it opened the following year. A week before the opening, I drove the completed road alone at dusk. The weather was clear, and the new tarmac was still dark and clean. As I reached the bend, my radio gave 3 soft clicks. The car's outside temperature dropped from 21 degrees to 14. A pale band appeared across the road ahead. It moved slowly from left to right, crossing the tarmac and the barriers without changing shape. I stopped before reaching it. The band passed over the empty ground inside the bend. For a few seconds, a broad oval shadow formed there. Nothing was visible in the sky. Then the shadow moved toward the road. The radio spoke in my own voice. Outside line. I reversed until I reached the straight section. The shadow stopped at the edge of the old survey curve. It remained there while I turned around and drove back toward town. The next morning, I checked the road from the opposite direction. Everything looked normal. On the new tarmac near the center of the bend, a small orange cross had appeared. It was dry and clean, with a slight hook on one side from a blocked nozzle. A second cross sat 10 meters beyond it, then a third. The marks continued around the empty patch of ground and disappeared over the rise. The aircraft started circling a little after 10 while I was washing dishes. I heard it pass over the back of the house, fade toward the road, then come around again from the west. It had a low, uneven engine sound that I recognized right away. Small propeller planes flew over our area all the time because there was a municipal airport about 12 miles south of us. Most of them crossed once and kept going. This one kept turning. My name was Elaine Foster. I was 42 then, living alone outside Athens, Georgia, in a 1-story house near the edge of a wooded subdivision. My husband and I had separated the year before, and my daughter was away at college. I had 2 neighbors close enough to see through the trees, but neither house was directly beside mine. It was a warm night in early April. Rain had moved through during the afternoon, and a low ceiling of gray cloud remained after dark. The air was still, not quiet exactly. Frogs were calling from the drainage pond, and water dripped from the gutters. But there was no wind. The plane passed again. The sound came from behind the kitchen window, moving left to right. It was loudest for maybe 10 seconds, then dropped away. About a minute later, I heard it returning from the front. I checked the time on the microwave, 10:08. I went into the living room and turned off the television. The engine became clearer without the background noise. It had a slow pulse to it. Not sputtering, more like the propeller speed rose and fell slightly every few seconds. I waited by the front window for it to pass. The sound crossed above the roof. I saw nothing through the glass except my own reflection and the wet street beyond the yard. That did not seem unusual because of the cloud cover. A plane could have been several thousand feet up and still sounded close in damp air. I went back to the kitchen. The next pass seemed lower. A drinking glass on the drying rack gave a faint rattle. The cabinet door above the sink vibrated against its frame. I opened a flight tracking app on my phone. There were 2 commercial flights west of Athens and 1 small aircraft near the airport, but nothing over my neighborhood. That happens sometimes. Not every private plane broadcast its location. I stepped onto the back porch. The engine noise continued over the trees. My porch light showed the yard, the fence, and the lower branches of the oaks. The clouds reflected some of the city glow and looked pale gray. I looked for navigation lights. Nothing moved above the trees. Then I noticed the branches. They were completely still. That should not have bothered me. The weather had been calm all evening, but the plane sounded low enough that I expected some movement in the treetops, or at least a shift in the clouds as it passed. The sound traveled from west to east. The branches did not move. The cloud cover did not change. I stood near the steps, listening until the engine faded behind the house. The frogs stopped, all of them. The silence lasted about 20 seconds. Then the aircraft came around again, and the frogs started at the same moment. I went inside and locked the back door. I called my neighbor across the road, Ruth Maddox. She was retired and usually stayed up late. "Do you hear that plane?" I asked. There was a pause. "What plane?" "It's circling over us." Ruth stepped outside while we stayed on the phone. I heard her screen door open. The engine passed over my house again. "Now," I said. "It's right above me." "I don't hear anything." It was loud enough in my kitchen that I had to raise my voice. "Nothing at all?" "I hear frogs." I walked to the front room and looked toward her house. Her porch light came on between the trees. The engine sound moved toward her property. Now it's coming your way." Ruth remained quiet for several seconds. "No, Elaine, there's no plane." I asked if she was joking. She said she was not. While she was still outside, I opened my front door. The engine was directly overhead. Ruth stood in her driveway, less than 100 yards away, holding her phone to her ear. She looked up at the sky, then toward me. "I don't hear it," she said through the phone. I could hear her voice twice, once from the phone and faintly across the road. The plane completed another circle. Ruth told me to come over if I was nervous. I almost did, but I felt embarrassed. I told her I was fine and ended the call. At 10:19, I began timing the passes. They came every 1 minute and 46 seconds. I used the stopwatch on my phone. The interval was exact 3 times in a row. The sound always appeared behind the house, crossed toward the front, faded near the eastern tree line, and returned from the west. The route made a circle around my property. Not the neighborhood, my property. I could tell because the sound remained centered over the roof. It never moved as far as Ruth's house, even though it seemed to be traveling in that direction. I checked all the windows and locked the side door. The next time it passed, I heard a faint click from the ceiling. It came from the smoke detector in the hallway. A small green light on it blinked, then stayed on. I stood beneath it and listened. The engine faded. The green light went dark. When the sound returned, the light came on again. I removed the battery. The detector gave one short chirp and then remained silent, but the green light stayed on even with the battery in my hand. I took it down from the ceiling and placed it on the dining table. The light followed the plane's movement. It brightened as the engine approached and dimmed as it moved away. That was the first moment I stopped thinking it was an ordinary aircraft. I called my brother Michael, who lived about 20 minutes away. He answered, and I explained what was happening. He listened while the sound passed over the house. "You hear it?" I asked. "I hear something." "What does it sound like?" He hesitated. "Like you have a fan running." I did not have a fan on. I held the phone toward the ceiling. The engine was loud enough to rattle the vent above the stove. Michael said all he could hear was a low hum. He offered to drive over. I told him yes. After we ended the call, I checked the time. 10:27. The engine had been circling for almost 20 minutes. I decided to record it. I opened the voice memo app, pressed the red button, and held the phone toward the ceiling. The aircraft stopped immediately. Not faded. Stopped. The propeller noise cut off in the middle of a pulse. The kitchen became silent. Even the frogs outside stopped again. I looked at the screen. The recording timer counted upward. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Nothing. I stopped recording. The engine resumed above the back porch. It started at full volume, as if it had been circling there in silence and somebody had turned the sound back on. I pressed record again. The noise stopped. I lowered the phone. After 8 seconds, I ended the recording. The engine returned. I tested it 4 times. Every time I began recording, the aircraft went silent. Every time I stopped, it continued from whatever point in the circle it should have reached. I played back the recordings. They contained a faint electrical hiss and a soft tapping sound. 3 taps near the start, 3 taps near the end. I had not heard tapping while recording. I sent one of the files to Michael. He called me back immediately. "Why did you send me an empty recording?" "There's tapping in it." "No, there isn't." I played it again. 3 taps came through my phone speaker. Michael heard nothing. He told me he was already on the road. At 10:34, the engine changed. The familiar propeller sound slowed until each pulse became separate. A pause. A pause. It was no longer circling at the same speed. It seemed to be holding over the house. The smoke detector on the table glowed steadily. A soft pressure built inside my ears. I went to the front window and looked up. The clouds remained still. A dark patch sat directly above the tallest oak in my yard. It was not a clear shape, just an area of cloud that looked slightly darker and flatter than the rest. When I shifted position, it seemed to remain over the same point. The engine sound came from that patch. I turned off the porch light to see better. The dark area vanished into the cloud cover. Then a pale light appeared behind the clouds. It was narrow and horizontal, like someone had drawn a short white line inside them. It moved slowly from left to right, stopped above my roof, then faded. The engine returned to its normal circling pattern. I tried taking a photograph. The sound stopped the moment the camera opened. I closed it. The engine resumed. I opened the video app. Silence. I switched the phone off completely. The sound came back. I put the phone in a kitchen drawer. The aircraft passed overhead again, louder than before. A knock came from the back door. Not a sudden bang. 3 slow taps against the glass. I froze beside the kitchen counter. The engine continued circling. 3 more taps came from the front window. Then 3 from the bedroom window. They moved around the house in the same direction as the sound above. Back door, front window, bedroom, kitchen. Each set came about 20 seconds apart. I did not go near the glass. I turned on every outside light from the switches by the door. The yard looked empty. The tapping continued, moving from window to window. When it reached the bathroom, the mirror gave a small vibration against the wall. That window was frosted glass and sat high above the bathtub. No person could have reached it without a ladder. I went into the bathroom anyway. The glass looked normal, except for a faint round mark near the top corner, like condensation from a fingertip. Another mark appeared beside it, then a third. Nobody touched the outside. I backed into the hallway. The engine passed directly overhead. The ceiling fan in the bedroom began turning. It was switched off. The blades moved slowly at first, then matched the uneven pulse of the aircraft sound. They accelerated when the sound rose and slowed when it dipped. I pulled the chain. Nothing changed. I switched off the breaker to the bedroom. The fan kept turning. The digital clock beside the bed showed 10:41. The numbers did not change. I checked the microwave, 10:41. My wristwatch had stopped at the same time. I took my phone from the drawer and powered it on. It showed 10:41. The engine continued its circle. I waited what felt like several minutes watching the clock. It stayed at 10:41. Outside, the frogs called in the same repeating pattern. 4 quick croaks, a long one, then silence. The exact sequence repeated without variation. The aircraft passed again. The sound slowed near the back of the house. For a few seconds, I heard something beneath the engine noise. A voice. It was faint and stretched out by the propeller rhythm. I could not understand the first pass. On the next circle, it became clearer. It sounded like someone saying my name, Elaine. The voice rose and fell with the engine. Elaine. I picked up my phone. The sound stopped before I opened any app. The clock changed to 10:42. I stood still, holding the phone. Nothing happened for nearly a minute. Then the phone screen went black. The engine resumed. The time returned to 10:41. I pressed the power button. No response. The tapping started on the roof. It moved from the back of the house toward the bedroom. Tap. Several feet of silence. Tap. Another pause. Tap. It sounded heavier than the taps on the windows. The ceiling gave a faint creak after each one. I went to the living room and picked up the fireplace poker. I did not have any plan for it. I just did not want empty hands. The tapping reached the area above me. The engine stopped circling. It held directly overhead. The low pulse became a steady vibration that I felt through the floor. A line of dust fell from the seam around the attic hatch. The hatch lifted slightly. It settled. Lifted again. The ladder inside gave a soft metallic squeak. I moved toward the front door. The porch light went out. So did the kitchen light. Then the hallway. The power failed, one room at a time, following the same path the sound had taken around the house. When the living room went dark, the only light came from the microwave clock in the kitchen. 10:41. I unlocked the front door. Before I opened it, a pale band of light moved across the bottom edge. It passed through the solid wood from left to right. The paint did not brighten. The light seemed to show beneath the surface, like the door had become thin. The band crossed my shoes. My feet went numb for a second. Then it continued across the wall and disappeared. The engine sound shifted toward the front yard. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air outside felt heavy and cold. Nothing moved. The branches were perfectly still. Water drops hung from the leaves without falling. The clouds had no visible motion. The engine circled above all of it. I looked toward Ruth's house. Her porch light was on, but she was no longer in the driveway. Her curtains were closed. At the end of my yard, near the oak, a pale shape stood between two tree trunks. It might have been mist. It was about the height of a person, but too narrow, and its edges faded into the darkness. I could not see arms, clothing, or a face. The aircraft sound passed above it. The shape seemed to tilt upward. A second pale form appeared farther back among the trees. Then a third. They did not walk into view. I simply noticed them one after another. I stepped back into the doorway. The first shape moved closer. It did not seem to take steps. The distance between us shortened while its body remained still. The engine pulse changed again. Under it, the voice repeated my name. Elaine. The shape reached the edge of the porch light. Its surface looked flat and colorless, like a reflection on glass. There were two darker areas near the top, but I could not tell whether they were features or gaps in the trees behind it. I raised the fireplace poker. The shape stopped. My phone turned on in my pocket. The screen lit through the fabric. The aircraft noise cut out. Every pale shape disappeared. Wind hit the yard all at once. Branches shook, water fell from the leaves, and the clouds began moving east. The frogs broke their repeating pattern and became a normal mess of sound. Headlights turned into my road. Michael's truck came around the corner. The microwave clock inside the house changed to 11:29. Nearly 48 minutes had passed since it showed 10:41. I remembered all of it, but it had not felt that long. Michael found me standing in the doorway with the poker. He checked the house, attic, yard, and roof with a flashlight. He found no one and no damage. The bedroom fan had stopped. The smoke detector remained on the dining table with its battery beside it. The green light was dark. Michael had heard no plane while driving in. Ruth came over after seeing his truck and said she had not heard anything since our phone call. We listened to the voice recordings together. On my phone, the tapping was still there. Neither of them could hear it. Michael copied one file to his phone. His version was silent. The original remained on mine until the next morning, when it disappeared along with the other recordings. I spent the night at Michael's house and returned home after sunrise. The sky was clear. Everything looked ordinary. I walked around the house checking the windows. Each one had 3 faint round marks on the outside glass. They were all at the same height, including the bathroom window. On the roof above my bedroom, a narrow strip of shingles looked cleaner than the rest. It formed a circle about 12 feet across, as if something had shielded that area from the rain. I called a roofing company. The inspector found no damage, but he asked whether I had been running some kind of machinery in the attic. I said no. He showed me the nails holding the roof decking. Every nail inside the circular area had backed out slightly, not enough to come loose, just enough that the heads sat above the wood. The nails outside the circle were normal. I stayed in the house after that. For several months, nothing happened. Then one night in October, I heard a small propeller plane in the distance. It crossed once from south to north. I stood in the kitchen listening until the sound faded. My phone was on the counter. The screen turned on by itself and opened the voice recorder. A new file appeared. It was 48 minutes long. The date was from the night in April. I pressed play. For most of the recording, there was only the aircraft circling and the sound of me moving through the house. Near the end, my front door opened. I heard myself step onto the porch. The engine stopped. A faint voice spoke from very close to the phone. It said, "She hears the outside." Then 3 slow taps came from somewhere above the microphone. The smoke detector blinked 4 times, paused, then blinked twice. I noticed it because the room was completely dark. I had closed the blackout curtains before going to bed, covered the bright clock on the television with a towel, and unplugged the phone charger because its little blue light bothered me. The smoke detector was the only thing visible above the bed. 4 flashes. A pause of maybe 3 seconds, 2 flashes, then 1 long flash. I watched the pattern repeat. 4, 2, 1. My name was Peter Lawson. I was 38 at the time, and I worked as a sales representative for a company that supplied commercial kitchen equipment. I spent around 100 nights a year in hotels, so I was used to strange air conditioners, hallway noise, blinking electronics, and alarms going off for no reason. This happened at a business hotel outside Sacramento, California, in late June. It was close to midnight, and the temperature outside had stayed above 90 degrees even after sunset. My room was on the 4th floor, overlooking a square courtyard with a pool and a few palm trees. I had checked in around 7, eaten in the restaurant downstairs, answered emails, and fallen asleep before 10. The blinking woke me at 11:46. At least, that was what the bedside clock showed. I lay still and watched the detector. 4 flashes, 2 flashes, 1 long flash. It was not the normal status light. Most hotel smoke detectors blinked once every 30 or 60 seconds. This one seemed almost deliberate. I turned my head to look straight at it. The flashing stopped. I waited. Nothing. When I looked toward the curtains instead, I saw another flash in the corner of my vision. I looked back. The detector was dark. I turned my face away but kept my eyes angled upward. 4 quick flashes appeared. Then 2. Then 1 that lasted about a second. I sat up. The light stopped immediately. I thought it might have a motion sensor or some kind of brightness detector, though I had never heard of a smoke alarm doing that. I switched on the bedside lamp and stood on the mattress to inspect it. It was an ordinary white detector with a small clear window on one side. There was no brand name I could see, only a printed inspection sticker dated 3 months earlier. I waved my hand beneath it. No reaction. I turned off the lamp and lay down again. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then the pattern started. 4, 2, 1. I picked up my phone and opened the camera. The flashing stopped before I began recording. I lowered the phone. It started again. I tried twice more with the same result. As soon as the phone camera faced the ceiling, the detector went dark. That should have been annoying more than frightening, but something about the timing bothered me. The light did not stop after I pressed record. It stopped when I raised the phone, before the lens even pointed at it. I called the front desk. A man named Caleb answered. I told him the smoke detector was flashing strangely and asked whether the hotel used a particular warning pattern. Is it beeping? He asked. No. Do you smell smoke? No. He said the green or red light might indicate that the detector was communicating with the building system. I asked if 4 flashes or 2 flashes and 1 long flash meant anything. He paused. They usually just blink once. I asked if maintenance could check it. He said the overnight maintenance worker was handling a plumbing problem on the 2nd floor, but he could move me to another room. I did not feel like packing everything at midnight over a blinking light, so I said I would call again if it started beeping. After hanging up, I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. While I was standing at the sink, I saw the detector reflected in the bathroom mirror. 4 flashes, 2 flashes, 1 long flash. I turned around. It stopped. I looked back into the mirror. The pattern resumed. The flashes seemed brighter in the reflection than they had from the bed. They were pale blue, not red or green. I stepped closer to the mirror. The detector flashed 4 times. Before the next group, something outside the bathroom window made a soft tapping sound. The room did not have a bathroom window. I stood still. The tapping came again, faint and high on the wall, as if somebody had touched the outside of the building. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. The smoke detector remained dark while I looked directly at it. I returned to the main room and checked the door. The deadbolt was locked. The security latch was in place. The air conditioner shut off. The sudden quiet made the room feel much larger. I could hear water moving through pipes in the wall and a television playing faintly in another room. Then I heard a low humming sound outside. It was steady, with no rise or fall. At first I thought it came from the hotel's rooftop equipment, but it seemed too close. The window glass vibrated lightly in its frame. The detector began flashing again. 4, 2, 1. This time, a faint blue light appeared around the edges of the curtains. I walked toward the window. The detector went dark when I passed beneath it, but the glow behind the curtains remained. I pulled one curtain back a few inches. The courtyard below looked normal. The pool lights were on, giving the water a dull turquoise color. Empty lounge chairs sat in rows. The palm fronds did not move. The sky above the courtyard was hazy and orange from city light. I saw 4 pale flashes reflected in the pool, then 2. Then 1 long flash. I leaned closer to the glass. The flashes came from somewhere above the courtyard, outside my field of view. They lit the surface of the pool but did not brighten the walls, balconies, or trees. 4, 2, 1. The same pattern as the detector. I opened the curtain wider and looked up. The hotel formed a square around the courtyard with balconies and windows on all 4 sides. From my room, I could see the roofline opposite me and a narrow section of sky above it. Nothing was there. The pattern appeared again in the pool reflection. I looked directly at the water. It stopped. When I shifted my eyes toward the opposite balconies, the flashes returned at the bottom edge of my vision. That was when I noticed the curtains in the room across the courtyard. They were open. A man stood at the window. He was several floors below the opposite roofline, roughly level with me. I could not see his face clearly because his room was dark, but I could make out his head and shoulders. He seemed to be looking upward. I raised one hand. He did not react. The blue flashes reflected in his window. 4, 2, 1. The man stepped back from the glass. The curtain closed slowly. I considered calling the front desk again, but I did not know what to report. A flashing smoke detector and lights reflected in a swimming pool did not sound like an emergency. I checked the time. The bedside clock still read 11:46. My phone showed 12:03. I watched the clock for several seconds. The numbers did not change. I unplugged it. The display stayed lit. 11:46. I carried it away from the wall. The power cord hung loose from the back, but the red numbers remained steady. The detector flashed in the reflection on the television screen. 4, 2, 1. I turned around. Dark. I faced the television again. The pattern repeated, but this time another light appeared beside the detector's reflection. It was a small pale point near the ceiling corner above the curtains. There was nothing in that corner when I looked directly at it. In the television reflection, the point moved slowly down the wall. I turned around again. The wall was empty. The humming outside grew stronger. The glass on the desk began trembling. Tiny rings moved across the water inside it. I called the front desk. No one answered. The phone rang until the line disconnected. I tried from my mobile. The call showed as connected, but I heard no ringing. Instead, I heard 4 soft clicks through the speaker, then 2, then 1 long tone. I ended the call. The smoke detector flashed once, not the usual pattern, 1 steady blue light that lasted several seconds. The room temperature dropped. The air conditioner remained off, but cold air moved across my face from the direction of the window. Condensation formed on the glass in a narrow horizontal band. The band began at the left side and moved slowly toward the right. As it passed, the courtyard beyond the window seemed to darken. The pool lights went out one by one, even though I could still see their glow under the water. The condensation stopped at the center of the pane. A clear oval appeared inside it. Through that oval, the sky looked black and sharp. I could see stars, though the rest of the sky over Sacramento remained hazy. A cluster of pale lights hung above the courtyard, 4 close together, 2 beneath them, 1 larger light lower down. They matched the detector's pattern exactly. I stepped back. The oval and the condensation remained fixed on the glass. The lights moved closer without growing brighter. They seemed to descend from high above the hotel, though I heard no aircraft and saw no beam. The low hum passed through the walls. A picture frame near the desk shifted slightly. The detector flashed 4 times. The lights outside answered with 4 pulses. Then 2, then 1. I pressed my hand against the wall beside the window. The drywall vibrated with a slow rhythm. Something tapped above the ceiling, 1 tap near the door, another closer to the bed, then another directly above the detector. The blue light in the detector stayed on. A shadow crossed the ceiling. It was soft and oval, about 6 feet wide. Nothing in the room could have made it. It moved from the curtains toward the door, then stopped over the bed. I stepped into the hallway. The hotel corridor was brightly lit and completely empty. My room door closed behind me before I touched it. I used my key card. The light on the lock flashed red. I tried again. Red. From inside the room, the smoke detector began clicking loudly enough for me to hear through the door. 4 clicks. 2 clicks. 1 long electronic buzz. I walked quickly toward the elevators. Every room door on the corridor had a folded evacuation notice attached to the back. As I passed, I heard quiet tapping from inside each room. Not all at once. The taps followed me. Room 417, then 419, then 421. Each set came from high on the wall near the ceiling. I pressed the elevator button. Both elevator displays showed the number 4. Neither door opened. The numbers changed together. 4, then 2, then 1. The displays went blank. I headed for the stairwell. Before I reached it, the man from the room across the courtyard stepped out of a doorway ahead of me. He was in his 50s, wearing pajama trousers and a white undershirt. His name, I later learned, was Raymond Pike. "Are you seeing the lights?" he asked. I said yes. He looked relieved for half a second, then frightened again. "They stop when I look at them." "Mine too." He pointed toward the ceiling. "Something's over the courtyard." The corridor lights dimmed. A pale blue glow appeared beneath each hotel room door. It moved along the hall toward us, passing from one door to the next without crossing the carpet between them. Raymond grabbed the stairwell handle. It would not move. I pulled beside him. The door felt locked, though there was no lock on the guest side. The glow reached the room behind us. The smoke detector inside began flashing through the gap beneath the door. 4, 2, 1. The hallway filled with the low hum. Raymond pressed both hands against his ears. The carpet rippled slightly, as if air were moving beneath it. A line formed in the ceiling tiles. It traveled from the far end of the corridor toward us. Each tile lifted a fraction of an inch as the line passed, then settled back into place. Something was moving above the ceiling, slowly. The motion stopped over Raymond. The detector inside the nearest room gave one long flash. Raymond's face turned pale. "I can hear my wife," he said. I heard nothing except the hum. He looked up. "She's saying my name." He told me his wife had died 3 years earlier. I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from that spot. The ceiling tile above him lowered slightly, as if pressure had been released. At the same moment, the stairwell door opened by itself. We went through and started down. The concrete stairwell smelled cold and damp. Emergency lights glowed on every landing. Our footsteps echoed normally until we reached the 3rd floor. Then a second set of footsteps joined us. They came from the flight above, one step after each of ours. I stopped. The following footsteps stopped. Raymond looked upward through the center gap of the stairs. I told him not to. A pale blue flash lit his face from above. 4 pulses, 2, 1 long. We continued downward. The extra footsteps followed, always one landing behind. At the 2nd floor, the stairwell door stood open. A hotel employee leaned into the opening. It was Caleb from the front desk. I recognized his voice when he asked what we were doing. I told him something was happening in the courtyard and the smoke detectors were acting strangely. He looked past us toward the stairs. "What detectors?" The footsteps above stopped. Caleb's radio gave 4 short bursts of static, then 2, then 1 long tone. His expression changed. He closed the stairwell door and told us to come with him. We walked through the second-floor corridor toward the lobby. Several guests had opened their doors. Some complained about the air conditioning. Others said they heard tapping in the walls. Nobody mentioned alarms. As we passed a window overlooking the courtyard, the blue pattern flashed in the glass. Caleb saw it. He stopped, but did not turn his head directly toward it. "You've had this before?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Not while I was working." That was all he would say. We reached the lobby. The automatic front doors were locked open, so we went outside into the heat. The air in the car park felt 20 degrees warmer than the hotel. Several guests followed us. From outside, the building looked normal. No lights hovered above it. No object was visible over the courtyard. The clouds moved slowly west, and traffic passed on the road beyond the hotel. I checked my phone. It read 12:31. Only 28 minutes had passed since I first called Michael, though the time in the room and hallway had felt longer. Hotel staff called the fire department. Firefighters checked the building, roof, courtyard, and alarm system. They found no smoke, electrical fault, or gas leak. The detector in my room was working normally. Its status light blinked green once every minute. The condensation on the window was gone. The bedside clock was dark because I had unplugged it. Caleb moved Raymond and me to rooms on the ground floor facing the car park. Neither of us wanted to return upstairs, so we sat in the lobby until sunrise. Around 5, Raymond asked Caleb what he meant when he said it had not happened while he was working. Caleb said a guest had complained about lights over the courtyard the previous winter. The hotel manager blamed construction cranes and aircraft. The guest checked out in the middle of the night. Housekeeping later found every smoke detector on the 4th floor removed from the ceiling and placed in a circle on the courtyard tiles. The alarm log showed no disconnection alerts. Caleb refused to say anything more. I checked out at 6:30 and drove home. The trip took about 2 hours. I stayed awake by keeping the radio loud and the windows cracked. Nothing followed me, and I reached my house shortly after 9. I carried my suitcase inside, made coffee, and called my manager to cancel the morning meeting. When I opened my laptop, a new video file was on the desktop. The timestamp matched 11:46 the previous night. The video lasted 11 minutes. It showed my hotel room from high above the bed, as though a camera had been fixed beside the smoke detector. I was asleep beneath it. At the 4-minute mark, the curtains opened by themselves. The courtyard outside was completely dark. 4 pale lights appeared above the window, then 2, then 1 large light. A narrow shadow moved from the window across the ceiling and stopped over my face. I remained asleep. The detector gave 1 long blue flash. The video ended with something tapping 3 times against the camera lens. The bees were already gathered at the top of the first hive when I opened it. They were not moving much. Thousands of them covered the upper edges of the frames in a thick, dark line, all facing east. None were down around the brood where they should have been, and none came up at me when I lifted the cover. That was the first thing that felt wrong. My name was Jonah Mercer. I kept 32 hives on rented farmland outside Mankato, Minnesota. I had been working with bees for almost 15 years, first helping my uncle, and later running a small honey business of my own. I was not one of those people who thought bees were magical or could sense every little change in the world. They were animals. They reacted to weather, food, disease, vibration, and smell. But I had never seen a colony arrange itself like that. It was a hot morning in late July. The temperature was already close to 80 by 9, and a steady southwest wind bent the soybean plants in waves. The sky was pale blue with a line of thin clouds over the eastern fields. I had gone out to check for mites and add another honey super to the stronger colonies. My helper, Caleb Ross, was supposed to meet me later, so I started alone at the northern row. Normally, opening a hive changed the mood immediately. Guard bees came up. Workers moved between the frames. You could feel the colony reacting to the light and the movement. Hive 1 stayed quiet. I could hear a low hum, but it was softer than usual. The bees along the frame tops did not turn toward me. Every head pointed toward the same side of the box, east. I waved my hand a few inches above them. Nothing. I touched the edge of one frame with my hive tool. A few bees shifted their feet, but they did not break formation. I checked the queen cells and brood. Everything looked healthy. There were eggs, larvae, capped brood, and plenty of stored pollen. No signs of poisoning. No dead bees on the bottom board. I closed the hive and opened the next one. The second colony was doing the same thing. So was the third. By the fifth hive, I stopped thinking it was some normal behavior I had missed. Every colony was gathered high in the boxes, packed along the eastern edges of the frames. All of them faced outward through the wooden walls. They were calm in a way that did not look peaceful. They looked occupied. I took off one glove and rested my palm against the side of the hive.